Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. This happened in the 1990s, specifically in June of 1993. I was 24 years old then, fresh out of college and already disillusioned with the corporate world. My name is Emily Foster, and this is the story of how a peaceful solo camping trip turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. The sun was setting as I guided my beat-up Volkswagen camper van along the winding roads leading to the Trinity Alps wilderness in Northern California. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the looming darkness of the dense forest ahead. I had quit my job at a small advertising firm in San Francisco just days before, the constant pressure and office politics having worn me down to my breaking point. On top of that, I'd ended my relationship with my boyfriend of 2 years, realizing we were growing in different directions. I needed space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to be alone. The Trinity Alps had always called to me. I'd seen pictures of its jagged peaks, pristine lakes, and ancient forests in outdoor magazines, and it seemed like the perfect place to find myself, or at least escape from everything for a while. As I navigated the increasingly narrow and bumpy roads, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was my first solo camping trip, and while I had some experience hiking and camping with friends, I'd never ventured this far into the wilderness alone. The radio crackled with static as I lost signal, the last remnants of civilization fading away. I popped in a mixtape, the familiar sounds of Nirvana's Come As You Are filling the van. It was a song that had become an anthem for my generation, and it felt fitting as I embarked on this journey of self-discovery. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. The headlights of my van cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead and casting eerie shadows among the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the depths of the woods, but I chalked it up to nerves and my overactive imagination. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I finally reached the trailhead near Canyon Creek Lakes. The parking lot was empty save for one dusty pickup truck, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. At least I wasn't entirely alone out here, I thought to myself as I parked the van. Stepping out, I was immediately enveloped by the cool night air, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the distant rush of a waterfall and the occasional hoot of an owl. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. I decided to sleep in the van that night and start my hike early in the morning. As I settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest outside seemed alive with whispers and movement, the branches of the trees scratching against the metal roof of the van like skeletal fingers. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of shadows moving in the periphery of my vision and the sensation of being watched. I woke several times during the night, my heart racing, only to find the van dark and still. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I rose, feeling groggy and unrested. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee on my portable stove, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. Today was the day I'd hike to my campsite, and I was determined to start it on a positive note. I shouldered my heavy backpack, locked up the van, and set off down the trail. The morning air was crisp and invigorating, and as I walked, I began to feel my spirits lift. The forest was beautiful in the early light, dew glistening on spider webs strung between branches, and mist rising from the damp ground. The hike to Canyon Creek Lakes was grueling, but breathtaking. Towering trees formed a canopy above, their branches filtering the sunlight into golden beams that danced across the forest floor. I crossed babbling streams on precarious log bridges and scrambled over moss-covered boulders, each step taking me further from civilization and deeper into the wilderness. By early afternoon, I reached my destination. The lake stretched out before me, its surface a mirror reflecting the surrounding peaks and forests. It was more beautiful than I could have imagined, and for a moment, all my worries and fears melted away. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, the water so clear I could see trout darting between the rocks. After a quick meal of granola bars and jerky, I spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area, taking photos with my old Nikon camera, and simply soaking in the peace and solitude I had been craving. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the campsite. The temperature dropped quickly, and I built a small fire, grateful for its warmth and light. Sitting there, watching the flames dance and listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. But as darkness fell, that feeling of unease from the previous night began to creep back. The forest seemed to grow denser, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. I crawled into my sleeping bag, ready for a long, uninterrupted sleep. But the forest had other plans. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, in my groggy state, I couldn't place it. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable snap of a branch breaking underfoot. My heart began to race as I lay there, straining to hear through the thin walls of the tent. It could have been a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Snap, crack. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I found the switch. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine a beam into the woods. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I saw no animals, no movement. "Get it together, Emily," I muttered, zipping the tent closed and forcing myself to lie back down. But sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch in the wind, sent my imagination into overdrive. I found myself holding my breath, listening intently for any sound that might indicate something or someone approaching my tent. As the night wore on, the noises seemed to intensify. What had started as occasional snaps and cracks evolved into what sounded like deliberate movement. Something was circling my campsite, always just out of sight. At one point, I could have sworn I heard whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just the wind in the trees or water lapping at the shore. But then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in these woods. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the growl faded into silence. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror and exhaustion. Every time I'd start to drift off, another noise would jerk me back to wakefulness. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the tent fabric, I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I unzipped the tent and peered out, half expecting to see the campsite in disarray or some monstrous creature lurking at the edge of the trees. But everything looked normal. The lake was calm, mist rising from its surface in the cool morning air. Birds chirped in the surrounding forest, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was as if the terrors of the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. I stepped out of the tent on unsteady legs, my body aching from the tension of the night. That's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. About 50 yards from my campsite, someone or something had carved a symbol into the bark of a massive old-growth pine. It was a spiral, crudely etched but unmistakable. The cuts looked fresh, sap still oozing from the wounded tree. I stared at it for a long moment, my gut telling me to pack up and leave immediately. But I shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing, I told myself. A prank by other hikers maybe, or some kind of trail marker I wasn't familiar with. Still, as I went about my morning routine, filtering water from the lake, making breakfast, planning my day hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest that had seemed so welcoming yesterday now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in around me. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, hoping that staying active would help calm my nerves. I packed a day bag with water, snacks, and my camera, and set off down one of the trails leading away from the lake. The hike helped clear my head, and as the morning wore on, I began to feel foolish about my fears from the night before. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight streaming through gaps in the canopy and wildflowers dotting the undergrowth. Around midday, I rounded a bend in the trail and came across another hiker. He was sitting on a fallen log beside the path, using a whetstone to sharpen a large hunting knife. He looked to be in his 60s, with a weathered face and a scraggly gray beard. His eyes, when they met mine, were sharp and alert. "Hey," I called out, relieved to see another person. "Beautiful day, huh?" He looked up from his knife, his expression serious. "You camping alone?" I hesitated, unsure whether to lie, but something in his demeanor made me think he might have valuable information. I nodded. "Yeah, just for a few days, down by Canyon Creek Lakes." He stood, tucking the knife into a sheath on his belt. "You see anything strange?" A chill ran down my spine. Strange how? Symbols, noises, things moving where they shouldn't be. I froze, thinking of the spiral carved into the tree and the sounds from the night before. Why? What's going on here? He glanced around, his expression grim. "They call her the Witch of the Woods, local legend. She doesn't like people on her land." "Are you serious?" I asked, half laughing to mask my unease. He shrugged. "Believe what you want. But if I were you, I'd head back to the trailhead before nightfall. These woods ain't safe after dark." With that, he shouldered his pack and continued down the trail, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of dread. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself that the old man was just trying to scare me, or that he was some local crackpot who spent too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't shake the memory of those noises in the night, or the freshly carved spiral on the tree. As I made my way back to my campsite, the forest seemed different. The shadows were deeper, the silence more oppressive. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I reached my tent just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lake. I decided to keep a fire going as long as I could, hoping its light and warmth would keep whatever was out there at bay. Sitting by the flickering flames, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I was a rational person after all. I didn't believe in witches or monsters or things that go bump in the night. But as darkness fell and the forest came alive with nighttime sounds, I found it harder and harder to cling to that rationality. Then the noises started again. This time it wasn't just snapping branches. There were whispers, faint and unintelligible, but definitely human or close to it. They seemed to come from all around me, as if the entire forest was conspiring to drive me mad. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, my breath catching as the beam illuminated something hanging from a nearby branch. It was a bundle of twigs and moss, tied together with what looked disturbingly like strands of human hair. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the firelight, her silhouette barely visible between the trees. At first I thought it was another hiker, a woman, tall and thin. But something about her posture was wrong. She was too still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch, and took a tentative step forward. The woman moved then, but not toward me. Instead, she turned and glided deeper into the forest, her movements unnervingly smooth, as if her feet weren't touching the ground. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get in my tent and wait for daylight, but something compelled me to follow. It was as if I was in a trance, my body moving of its own accord. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, as if the very earth was alive and restless. The air grew colder, and a mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around my ankles. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dark, primeval forest. But finally I emerged into a small clearing. At its center was an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss and surrounded by the same spirals I'd seen carved into the tree. The woman stood beside it, her back to me. In the flickering light of my makeshift torch, I could see that her clothes were tattered and stained, hanging off her skeletal frame in ragged strips. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunk in black pits, her lips curled into a jagged smile, revealing teeth that were long and sharp. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like the crack of dry branches. She reached out a clawed hand toward me. I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind me I could hear her laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as if it were coming from all around me. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging scratches. Roots seemed to rise up from the ground, trying to trip me. But I kept running, driven by pure terror. When I finally burst out of the trees and into my campsite, I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran straight for my van, fumbling with the keys, as I heard something crashing through the underbrush behind me. The engine sputtered as I turned the key, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought it wouldn't start. But then it roared to life, just as a shadow fell across the windshield. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I just slammed my foot on the accelerator and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles from the trailhead, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Only then did I pull over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. As the adrenaline began to fade, I found myself questioning everything I'd experienced. Had it all been real, or was it just an extremely vivid nightmare brought on by camping alone in an unfamiliar place? But then I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. My face was scratched and dirty, leaves and twigs tangled in my hair. And around my neck, where the witch had reached out to me, was a thin red line, as if something sharp had just grazed my skin. It hadn't been a dream. Whatever I had encountered in those woods was real. I drove straight back to San Francisco, arriving home as the city was just waking up. My apartment felt strange and unfamiliar after my time in the wilderness, but I had never been so glad to see those four walls. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I researched local legends about the Trinity Alps, looking for any mention of a witch or similar entity. I found a few vague stories, whispered tales of hikers going missing and strange sightings in the woods, but nothing concrete. I considered reporting my experience to the park rangers or local authorities, but what would I say? That I was chased through the woods by a witch? That I heard whispers in the forest and saw impossible things? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was making it all up for attention. So I kept quiet, but the memories of that night haunted me. I had trouble sleeping, jolting awake at the slightest sound outside my window. During the day, I'd find myself staring off into space, reliving those terrifying moments in the forest. About a week after I returned, I developed the roll of film from my camera. Most of the photos were what I expected: beautiful landscapes, shots of the lake and mountains. But there was one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture I'd taken of the lake at sunset. In the foreground was the shoreline and some trees, nothing unusual. But in the background, barely visible in the shadows between two distant pines, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with its head tilted at an odd angle. I dropped the photo as if it had burned me. It was her, the witch, and I had proof. That night I woke to the sound of branches snapping outside my window. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, straining to hear. Then came the whispers, faint but unmistakable, the same whispers I'd heard in the forest. I shot out of bed and ran to the window, yanking open the curtains. For a split second I saw her, the gaunt face, the black eyes, the twisted smile. Then she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the quiet city street. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I found a bundle of twigs and moss on my doorstep, tied with strands of long, dark hair. Over the next few months, these occurrences became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of her out of the corner of my eye, on crowded streets, in the reflection of store windows, always gone when I turned for a better look. I'd find those bundles in strange places, on my desk at work, in my mailbox, once even on the pillow next to me when I woke up. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was happening. How could I explain that I was being haunted by something I'd encountered in the woods, something that shouldn't exist? I sought help from a therapist, careful to frame my experiences as nightmares and anxiety. She prescribed medication for sleep and anxiety, but it didn't help. If anything, the dulled senses from the pills made me feel more vulnerable. I threw myself into researching folklore and legends, looking for any information about similar entities. I found stories from various cultures about forest spirits and witches, but nothing that quite matched what I'd experienced. The closest were tales of the Baba Yaga from Slavic mythology, but even those didn't capture the true horror of what I'd encountered. As summer turned to fall, I began to consider that I might actually be losing my mind. Maybe the stress of quitting my job and ending my relationship had finally caught up with me. Maybe I was having some kind of prolonged psychotic break. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. What I'd seen and experienced was real, as impossible as it seemed. In October, about 4 months after my camping trip, things escalated. I woke one night to find my apartment filled with mist, the same unnatural mist I'd seen in the forest. The whispers were all around me, louder than ever before. And there she was, standing at the foot of my bed, the witch. Her black eyes bore into mine, her mouth open in a silent scream. I scrambled back against the headboard, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. Her jaw snapped shut and she tilted her head, regarding me with those bottomless black eyes. When she spoke, her voice was like rustling leaves and cracking ice. "You trespassed," she said. "You entered my domain uninvited. And now you must pay the price." She reached out one of those skeletal hands toward me, her fingers elongating into razor-sharp claws. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then suddenly, there was silence. I opened my eyes to find my bedroom normal again. No mist, no whispers, no witch, just the soft glow of streetlights through my window and the distant sound of traffic. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? I wasn't sure anymore. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly in fear, never knowing what was real and what wasn't. I had to go back to the Trinity Alps, back to where it all began. I had to confront whatever this thing was and find a way to end it. I took a leave of absence from my new job, packed up my van, and headed north. As I drove, I tried to prepare myself for what I might find. I brought sage for cleansing, salt for protection, and an assortment of charms and talismans I'd collected during my research into the supernatural. But mostly I brought my determination to end this nightmare, one way or another. The drive to the Trinity Alps felt both faster and longer than I remembered. Every mile brought a mixture of dread and anticipation. The rational part of my brain still tried to argue that I was chasing shadows, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But I knew better now. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The parking lot was empty this time, not even a single other vehicle. As I stepped out of my van, the silence hit me like a physical force. No bird song, no rustle of leaves in the wind, just an oppressive, waiting silence. I shouldered my backpack, heavier now with the addition of my supernatural safeguards, and set off down the trail. With each step, memories of my last hike here flooded back. But where before the forest had seemed beautiful and inviting, now it felt menacing. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows seemed to move in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look. I made it to my old campsite just as the sun was setting. The lake, which had once seemed so pristine and peaceful, now looked dark and forbidding. I set up my tent with shaking hands, laying lines of salt around its perimeter. As darkness fell, I built a fire, remembering how I'd huddled by one on that terrifying night months ago. I sat there waiting, the flames casting flickering shadows that made every tree and bush seem alive and moving. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Despite my fear, I found myself growing drowsy. My eyes would drift closed, only to snap open at the slightest sound. But nothing happened. No whispers, no snapping branches, no sign of the witch. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake in coming back, that maybe it had all been in my head after all, I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting, coming from deep in the woods. The words were in no language I recognized, but they seemed to resonate in my very bones. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, my heart racing. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and longing for. I stepped beyond the circle of salt, beyond the light of my fire, and into the darkness of the forest. The chanting grew louder as I walked, guiding me deeper into the woods. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness. Finally, I emerged into a clearing, the same clearing I'd found months ago. The stone altar stood at its center, but it was different now. Symbols had been carved into its surface, glowing with a faint, sickly green light. Around it, hooded figures moved in a slow circle, their chanting rising and falling like waves. And there, standing atop the altar, was the witch. She looked even more terrifying than I remembered. Her skin was pale as moonlight, stretched tight over her bones. Her hair writhed around her head like living shadows. Those black, empty eyes fixed on me as I entered the clearing. The chanting stopped. The hooded figures turned to face me, their features hidden in the depths of their cowls. "You came back," the witch said, her voice like the wind through dead leaves. "Foolish girl, you should have stayed away." I swallowed hard, summoning every ounce of courage I possessed. "I couldn't," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You wouldn't let me. You've been haunting me, following me. I need to know why. What do you want from me?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Want? I want what I've always wanted, to be left alone. This forest is my domain, my kingdom. You humans, with your campfires and your trash and your noise, you're destroying it, piece by piece, year by year." She stepped down from the altar, moving towards me with that unnaturally smooth gait. "But you're different. You saw me, really saw me. Do you know how long it's been since that happened?" I shook my head, unable to speak as she drew closer. "Centuries," she hissed. "Centuries of watching, of whispering, of trying to drive your kind away. And then you came. You followed me into the woods that night. You were afraid, yes, but also curious, intrigued." She was right in front of me now. This close, I could see that her eyes weren't just black. They were like looking into the night sky, filled with pinpricks of light like distant stars. "Join us," she said, her voice almost gentle now. "Become one with the forest. Leave behind your world of concrete and machines. Here you could be something more, something powerful." For a moment I was tempted. I thought of my life back in the city. The stress, the noise, the constant pressure. Here in the woods I could escape all of that. I could be part of something ancient and mysterious. But then I thought of my friends, my family. I thought of all the good things in the world, the beauty and kindness that existed alongside the ugliness and cruelty. And I knew I couldn't give that up. "No," I said, taking a step back. "I'm sorry, but no, this isn't my world. And what you're doing, haunting me, scaring people away, it's wrong. There has to be a better way." The witch's face contorted in anger. "Then you will join us in another way," she snarled. She raised her arms and the hooded figures began to advance on me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handful of salt, flinging it in a wide arc. The witch screamed as the grains hit her, her skin sizzling where they touched. The hooded figures backed away, hissing. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Behind me I could hear them giving chase, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I kept running. I burst out of the trees and into my campsite, diving for my tent. I grabbed my backpack and ran for the trail, not bothering to break down the tent or put out the fire. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally reached my van, I threw myself inside and started the engine. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The witch, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was back in San Francisco. As the sun rose over the city, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Whatever connection had been forged between me and that thing in the woods, it was broken now. I was free. In the months that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I wrote it all down, every detail I could remember. Not to publish or share. I still think most people would consider me crazy if I told them. But for myself, to remind myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined it. I've never gone camping again. The thought of sleeping in a tent, of being alone in the wilderness, still fills me with dread. But I've found other ways to connect with nature. Day hikes in populated areas, visits to botanical gardens. I've learned to appreciate the beauty of the natural world without losing myself in it. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake to the sound of branches snapping outside my window, or catch a whiff of that forest mist. But it's rare now, and growing rarer. I hope that chapter of my life is truly over. But I'll never forget, And I'll always wonder about that witch, that spirit, whatever she was. Is she still there in the Trinity Alps, watching and waiting? Are there others like her in forests around the world? And how many people have encountered them, but been too afraid or too disbelieved to tell their stories? I don't have answers to these questions, but I know what I experienced. And I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. So if you're ever in the wilderness, and you feel eyes watching you from the trees, or hear whispers on the wind that sound almost like words, be careful, be respectful, and maybe, just maybe, leave an offering before you go. Because you never know who or what might be listening. This happened in the 1990s. It was 1996, and I was spending my days hiding out in a small cabin deep in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. The Ouachita National Forest stretched out before me, a vast sea of green that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I'd been here for 3 months now, and still, the sheer size of it all took my breath away. My name's Cade Whistler, and I came here to escape. From what? Hell, take your pick. A failed marriage, a string of dead-end jobs, and a general disgust with the rat race that had consumed my life for the past decade. The cabin I'd rented was nothing special, just a simple one-room affair with a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a bed that had seen better days. But it was mine, at least for now. And it was as far from civilization as I could get without completely falling off the grid. That particular day had started like any other. I woke up with the sun, made a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and sat on the rickety porch watching the mist rise from the forest floor. It was peaceful in its own way, but there was always an undercurrent of something. Like the forest was alive, watching, waiting. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every small town has its share of local legends, and the areas surrounding the Ouachita were no different. Tales of strange lights in the woods, of hikers gone missing, of sounds that couldn't be explained. I'd brushed them off as nothing more than campfire stories, designed to keep tourists on their toes and locals entertained during the long winter months. But sitting there, watching the shadows shift and dance as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to those stories than I'd initially thought. I spent most of the day doing what I'd come here to do, absolutely nothing. I read a bit, attempted to write in the journal I'd brought and quickly abandoned, and even tried my hand at whittling. By late afternoon, I'd managed to turn a perfectly good piece of wood into a mangled mess that bore no resemblance to anything found in nature. As the day wore on, I found myself growing restless. The quiet that had seemed so appealing when I first arrived now felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I needed to move, to do something, anything to break the monotony. That's when I decided to take a walk. In hindsight, it was a stupid decision. I knew the basics of wilderness survival, sure, but I was far from an expert. And the Ouachita National Forest wasn't some city park where you could wander off the path and still find your way back to the parking lot. This was real wilderness, unforgiving and vast. But the walls of the cabin were closing in, and I needed out. So I laced up my boots, grabbed a small backpack with some water and snacks, and headed out into the gathering twilight. The forest was different as night fell. The friendly green canopy that had sheltered me during the day now loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. Shadows deepened, taking on strange, almost living qualities. More than once I found myself stopping, sure that I'd seen something move just at the edge of my vision. But each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I realized I'd made a critical error. In my haste to escape the confines of the cabin, I'd forgotten to bring a flashlight. The moon, when it managed to peek through the dense canopy, provided little illumination. I was, for all intents and purposes, lost in a darkening forest with no real way to find my way back. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep up my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Think, Cade," I muttered. "Use your head." I knew the basics. Stay put, wait for daylight, try to retrace your steps. but standing still in the deepening gloom seemed impossible. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I was sure that at any moment something was going to come crashing out of the underbrush. That's when I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a wolf. I knew that much. Wolves had been extinct in Arkansas for decades. Coyotes maybe, but this sound was different. Deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood frozen, straining my ears in the darkness. For a long moment there was nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, the howl came again, closer this time, and accompanied by a sound I couldn't quite place. A sort of wet, slapping noise, like something heavy being dragged through the underbrush. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but run where? I was lost, surrounded by darkness on all sides. Running blindly through the forest was a sure way to break an ankle, or worse, so I did the only thing I could think of. I found the largest tree nearby and began to climb. It wasn't easy in the dark, and more than once I nearly lost my grip on the rough bark. But fear is a powerful motivator, and somehow I managed to haul myself up onto a sturdy branch about 15 feet off the ground. I clung to the trunk, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there would hear it. The sounds were closer now. The dragging, slapping noise was punctuated by snuffling and what sounded like heavy breathing. Then, in a patch of moonlight not 20 yards from my perch, I saw it. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, easily 7 feet tall, but hunched over in a way that made it seem almost deformed. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, ending in hands that seemed more like claws. But it was the face that sent a jolt of primal terror through me. It was like someone had taken a wolf's head and stretched it, elongating the snout and enlarging the jaws. But there was an intelligence in its eyes that no animal should have possessed. It stood there, sniffing the air, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that it was hunting me. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move a muscle. The thing below me, and I couldn't think of it as anything but a thing, tilted its head as if listening. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it dropped to all fours and loped off into the darkness. I stayed in that tree for what felt like hours, too terrified to climb down, too afraid to call for help. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the leaves, I nearly wept with relief. As I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs, I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen had been a product of fear and exhaustion. A bear, maybe, or some other large animal distorted by shadows and my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something out there in the Ouachita National Forest, something that shouldn't exist. And I had a sinking feeling that my encounter with it was far from over. The walk back to the cabin seemed to take an eternity. Every shadow, every rustling leaf had me jumping, sure that at any moment that thing would come bursting out of the underbrush. But somehow, I made it back just as the sun was fully rising over the treetops. I stumbled through the door, slamming it behind me and throwing the lock for good measure. Not that a simple lock would do much good against what I'd seen, but it made me feel a little better. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to light the stove and get some coffee going. As the bitter aroma filled the small cabin, I sank into a chair and tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there, head back to civilization, back to a world where the most frightening things were rush hour traffic and past due bills. But I knew I couldn't. For one thing, I had no car. The cabin's owner, a grizzled old man named Hank, had driven me out here 3 months ago with the agreement that he'd come back in 6 months to either pick me up or resupply me, depending on how I was faring. I had a radio for emergencies, but what was I going to say? That I'd seen a monster in the woods? They'd think I was crazy or worse, drunk. No, I was stuck here, at least for now. The day passed in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake at every sound. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been a particularly vivid nightmare. Almost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, that nagging doubt returned. I found myself pacing the small confines of the cabin, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. That's when I smelled it. A scent so foul it made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat mixed with something metallic like old pennies, and underneath it all a musky odor that reminded me of wet dog. It was coming from outside. I grabbed the shotgun from its place above the fireplace, fumbling with the shells as I loaded it. My hands were sweating, making the smooth metal slippery. I managed to get 2 shells in before I heard it. A low growl right outside the cabin door. I froze, the shotgun half raised. For a moment there was silence. Then something hit the door with enough force to make the whole cabin shudder. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the gun. Another blow struck the door, and I saw the wood begin to splinter. Whatever was out there, it was getting in. In that moment, fear gave way to a sort of calm clarity. I knew I had 2 choices. I could cower in a corner and hope it went away, or I could fight. I chose to fight. As the door finally gave way with a thunderous crack, I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the small space, and for a moment all I could see was smoke. Then I heard it, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek of pain. As the smoke cleared, I saw the creature framed in the doorway. My shot had caught it in the shoulder, and dark, viscous blood was oozing from the wound. But it wasn't dead. Far from it. It lunged forward, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I managed to get off another shot, but in my panic I missed. The creature slammed into me, knocking the gun from my hands and sending us both crashing to the floor. The stench of it was overwhelming. Up close I could see every detail of its twisted face, the elongated snout filled with teeth that seemed too large for its mouth, the eyes yellow and filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my shirt and leaving bloody furrows in my skin. I screamed, more in terror than pain, and tried to push it off me, but it was too strong, too heavy. As its jaws snapped inches from my face, I did the only thing I could think of. I jammed my thumb into one of its eyes. The creature reared back, howling in agony. It was enough. I scrambled away, my hand closing around the first weapon I could find, the fire poker. As the thing lunged at me again, I swung with all my might. The iron poker connected with its head with a sickening crunch. It staggered, shaking its misshapen head as if to clear it. I didn't give it a chance to recover. I swung again and again, each blow fueled by terror and desperation. I don't know how long I kept at it. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally stopped, the creature lay still. I stood there, chest heaving, the bloody poker still clutched in my trembling hands. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture overturned, blood, both mine and the creature's, splattered across the floors and walls. And on the floor, illuminated by the flickering light of the overturned lamp, lay something that should not exist. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the body. Part of me was afraid to look away, terrified that if I did, it would somehow disappear. Another part wanted nothing more than to run, to put as much distance between myself and this thing as possible. But I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that what had happened was real. With shaking hands, I retrieved my camera from the desk drawer. It was an old Polaroid, the kind that spits out photos instantly. I'd brought it with me to document my wilderness adventure. Funny how things turn out. I took several photos, trying to capture every angle of the creature. As each photo developed, I felt a mix of relief and renewed terror. It was real. It was all real. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain hit me. My chest was on fire where the thing's claws had raked across it. I stumbled to the bathroom, nearly retching when I saw my reflection in the cracked mirror. I looked like I'd gone 10 rounds with a mountain lion, which I supposed wasn't too far from the truth. I cleaned and bandaged my wounds as best I could, all the while keeping one eye on the creature's body. Part of me was afraid it would somehow get up, shake off its injuries like some horror movie monster. But it remained still. Dead, I hoped. As I finished patching myself up, a new fear began to creep in. What was I going to do with the body? I couldn't leave it here. The smell alone would be unbearable in a day or two. And what if someone came to check on me? How would I explain this? No, I had to get rid of it. But how? In the end, I decided to bury it. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. I spent the rest of the night digging a deep hole in the clearing behind the cabin. It was back-breaking work, made worse by my injuries and the constant fear that more of these things might be lurking in the darkness. As dawn broke, I dragged the creature's body out and rolled it into the hole. It was heavier than I expected, and moving it reopened some of my wounds. But finally it was done. I filled in the hole, then covered it with branches and leaves. To anyone passing by, it would look like nothing more than a slightly disturbed patch of forest floor. Exhausted, in pain, and more scared than I'd ever been in my life, I made my way back to the cabin. I knew I should try to clean up, to erase the evidence of the night's events, but I was running on empty. I barely managed to drag myself to the bed before collapsing into a deep, mercifully dreamless sleep. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky. For a moment I lay there trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, but the ache in my body and the metallic smell of blood that still lingered in the air told me otherwise. I forced myself out of bed and began the grim task of cleaning up. I scrubbed the floors, threw out the broken furniture, and did my best to patch up the splintered door. By the time I was done, the cabin looked, well, not normal, but at least less like the scene of a life-or-death struggle. As I worked, my mind raced. What was that thing? Where had it come from? And most importantly, were there more of them out there? I knew I should leave. Pack up what I could carry and start walking. Eventually I'd reach a road or a town or something. But something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the realization that if I left, if I tried to tell anyone what had happened, they'd think I was insane. No, I had to stay. At least for now. I had to figure out what was going on in these woods. Because one thing was clear, the legends, the stories, the stories I dismissed as local superstition had more truth to them than I'd ever imagined. And if I was going to survive, I needed to understand what I was up against. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and frantic research. I dug through every book I'd brought with me, searching for anything that might explain what I'd encountered. But unsurprisingly, none of my wilderness survival guides had a chapter on what to do when attacked by a wolfman. I found myself wishing I'd paid more attention to the local stories when I first arrived. At the time, I'd written them off as the kind of tall tales you hear in any small town. But now, those fragmented memories were all I had to go on. There had been talk of something in the woods, of course. Vague warnings about not wandering too far off the trails, especially at night. But there had been other stranger stories too. Tales of livestock found torn apart in ways that didn't match any known predator. Of strange howls echoing through the forest on moonless nights, and whispered accounts of hikers gone missing, only to turn up weeks later, miles from where they'd disappeared, with no memory of what had happened to them. As I pieced these stories together in my mind, a pattern began to emerge. Whatever was out there, it wasn't new to these woods. It had been here for years, maybe even decades, hiding just out of sight of the civilized world. But that raised an even more troubling question. If these creatures had been around for so long, why hadn't they been discovered? Why weren't the woods crawling with scientists and cryptozoologists searching for proof? The answer, when it came to me, was chilling in its simplicity. Because anyone who got too close didn't live to tell about it. I'd been lucky or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it, to survive my encounter. On the fourth day after the attack, I decided I needed to go back to where it all started. The spot in the woods where I'd first seen the creature. It was a risk, I knew. There could be more of them out there. But I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them sitting in the cabin. This time I went prepared. I had the shotgun fully loaded, strapped across my back, a large hunting knife on my belt, and in my backpack, alongside water and provisions, I'd packed a few homemade weapons, Molotov cocktails made from empty beer bottles and rags soaked in kerosene. I didn't know if fire would be effective against these things, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have the option. The hike back to that fateful spot took longer than I remembered. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge, my hand constantly straying to the butt of the shotgun. But the forest remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. It was as if the normal wildlife had sensed the presence of a predator and gone into hiding. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd climbed the tree, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool autumn air. The place looked normal, peaceful even. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. If I hadn't known what had happened here, I might have found it beautiful. But I did know, and that knowledge turned the serene scene into something sinister. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential attack. I began my search, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Some sign of the creature's passage, perhaps. A tuft of fur, a footprint, anything that might give me a clue as to what I was dealing with. For hours I combed the area, expanding my search in ever-widening circles. Just as I was about to give up, something caught my eye. There, at the base of a large oak tree, was a patch of disturbed earth. It might have been nothing, an animal's burrow perhaps, but something about it didn't look quite right. I approached cautiously, shotgun at the ready. As I got closer, I saw that the disturbed area was larger than I'd first thought, and there was something else. A smell, faint but unmistakable. The same rotting, metallic odor I'd noticed just before the creature attacked. My heart pounding, I began to dig. The earth was loose, easy to move. Whatever had been buried here, it hadn't been done long ago. As I dug deeper, the smell grew stronger, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. Then my hand struck something solid, something that wasn't rock or root. I scraped away more dirt, revealing what lay beneath. When I saw it, I scrambled back, nearly dropping the shotgun in my haste. It was a bone, a human bone, and it wasn't alone. As I stared in horror, I realized I'd uncovered what could only be described as a makeshift grave. But this was no careful burial. The bones were jumbled together, broken and gnawed upon. This wasn't a grave, it was a dump site, a place where those things discarded the remains of their prey. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get as far away from this place as possible, but I knew I couldn't. This was evidence, proof that what was happening in these woods was more than just an isolated incident. With shaking hands, I took out my camera and began documenting what I'd found. Each click of the shutter felt like a gunshot in the quiet forest. I kept expecting to hear that low, menacing growl, to turn and find myself face to face with another of those creatures. But nothing came. The forest remained silent, indifferent to the grisly scene I'd uncovered. When I'd taken as many photos as I dared, I began the grim task of reburying the remains. It felt wrong somehow to leave them like this. But I knew I couldn't risk moving them, and maybe, just maybe, if I could find a way to alert the authorities without implicating myself, these poor souls might finally be laid to rest properly. As I worked, my mind raced. How many more sites like this were there in these woods? How long had this been going on? And most pressingly, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't just walk away, not now that I knew the truth. But what could one man do against whatever these things were? As I finished covering the gravesite, doing my best to make it look undisturbed, I made a decision. I would stay. I would dig deeper, uncover whatever secrets these woods were hiding. And somehow, some way, I would find a way to stop this. But first I needed more information. And for that I realized I was going to have to do the one thing I'd been avoiding since I arrived in these woods. I was going to have to talk to the locals. The trip back to the cabin was a blur. My mind was reeling from what I'd discovered, trying to process the implications. Those bones I'd found. How many people had met their end in these woods? How many families were out there still wondering what had happened to their loved ones? I spent the night in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. I dreamed of yellow eyes watching me from the darkness, of claws reaching for me, of bones scattered across the forest floor. When dawn finally broke, I made my decision. I had to go into town. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin was terrifying, but I needed answers, and more than that, I needed supplies. My stock of food was running low, and after what I'd seen, I wanted to be prepared for a long stay. The nearest town, if you could call it that, was a place called Whispering Pines. It was little more than a general store, a gas station, and a handful of houses clustered around a single intersection. But it was my best bet for both supplies and information. I set out early, the morning mist still clinging to the trees. The hike to where I'd left my truck months ago took longer than I remembered, my pace slowed by constant vigilance. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me reaching for the shotgun strapped to my back. But nothing came for me. By mid-morning, I'd reached my truck. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and pine needles, but it started on the first try. The familiar rumble of the engine was comforting, a reminder of the world I'd left behind. The drive to Whispering Pines took about an hour, the road winding through dense forest before finally opening up into farmland. As I pulled into town, I could feel eyes on me. Small towns are like that. Everyone notices a newcomer. I parked in front of the general store, taking a deep breath before getting out. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the conversation at the counter immediately died down. 3 old men, the kind you'd expect to see in any small-town store, turned to look at me. "Well, look who's finally come down from the mountain," one of them said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Thought you might have turned into a bear up there, son." I forced a smile, trying to appear more at ease than I felt. "Just needed some supplies," I said, grabbing a basket and starting to fill it. As I moved through the aisles, I could hear them whispering behind me. Snippets of conversation reached my ears. "Been up there for months. Heard something the other night. Just like back in '82. I tried to listen without being obvious about it, but they clammed up whenever I got too close. As I brought my purchases to the counter, canned goods, ammunition, first aid supplies, the oldest of the men, a wiry fellow with a scraggly white beard, eyed me carefully. "You been having any trouble up there?" he asked as he rang up my items. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Trouble?" He shrugged, but his eyes were sharp. "Folks been talking about strange noises in the woods lately, animals acting spooked, that sort of thing." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I've heard some things," I admitted. "Weird howls at night. Seen some tracks I can't identify. You know anything about that?" The old man exchanged glances with his friends. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen, son, those woods, they ain't natural. There's things up there that don't belong in this world. Things that have been there longer than any of us have been alive. You'd do well to come back to town. Ain't safe for a man alone up there." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to press him for more information, but something in his eyes stopped me. Fear, real, genuine fear. "Thanks for the warning," I managed to say. "I'll keep that in mind." As I turned to leave, he called out to me, "Hey, if you do decide to stay up there, be careful after dark. And whatever you do, don't go out on the full moon. That's when they hunt." The drive back to my truck was tense, my mind racing with what I'd learned. The old man's words echoed in my head. Things that don't belong in this world. What did that mean? And what was the significance of the full moon? As I loaded my supplies into the truck, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My heart skipped a beat. Had someone been watching me? With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry. "If you want the truth, come to the old Miller place at sunset. Come alone, and for God's sake, be careful." I stared at the note, my mind whirling. This could be a trap. For all I knew, I was being set up by whatever was out there in the woods. But it could also be my best chance at getting some real answers. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, I made my decision. I would go to the Miller place. But I would go prepared for anything. The old Miller farm was about 5 miles outside of town, down a winding dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. By the time I pulled up to the dilapidated farmhouse, the sun was a red sliver on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I parked a good distance from the house, not wanting to announce my presence too loudly. The shotgun was a comforting weight in my hands as I approached the building, every sense on high alert. The house was a wreck, its windows broken, its paint peeling. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges. As I stepped onto the porch, the old boards creaked ominously under my weight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the gathering darkness. "Anyone here?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, from the depths of the house, I heard a voice. "In here, hurry." I hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was a bad idea, but I'd come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the house. The interior was dark, the last rays of sunlight barely penetrating the grime-covered windows. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a scene of decay and abandonment. "Over here," the voice called again, coming from what must have been the kitchen. I moved cautiously, the beam of my flashlight sweeping back and forth. As I entered the kitchen, I saw a figure hunched over an old table. It was a man, elderly by the looks of him, his face lined with age and worry. "You the fella staying up in old Hank's cabin?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously to the windows. I nodded, keeping the shotgun ready. "Who are you? Why did you want to meet me here?" The old man sighed, a sound full of weariness and fear. "Name's Frank Miller. This used to be my place before they came." "They?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew what he meant. Frank nodded, his eyes haunted. "The things in the woods, the ones that ain't natural. They've been here for generations, hiding in the deepest parts of the forest. Most folks don't believe in 'em, think they're just stories, but I've seen 'em. And from the look on your face, I reckon you have too." I swallowed hard, nodding. "What are they?" Frank shook his head. "Don't rightly know. Some say they're cursed men turned into beasts. Others think they're something that came from somewhere else. All I know is they're dangerous, and they're getting bolder." He reached into his coat, pulling out a battered leather journal. This was my grandfather's. He was the first to really try to understand what was happening in these woods. Spent years tracking them, studying them. Damn near got himself killed more times than I can count. He held out the journal to me with a shaking hand. "I'm too old to do anything about this. But you might have a chance. Take it. Learn what you can, and for God's sake, be careful." As I reached for the journal, a howl split the night. It was close, too close. Frank's eyes widened in terror. "They're here," he whispered. "Run, run." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, the journal clutched tightly in one hand, the shotgun in the other. Behind me I heard Frank shouting, trying to distract whatever was out there. I made it to my truck just as something huge and dark burst from the tree line. I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes, of teeth gleaming in the moonlight, before I threw myself into the cab and gunned the engine. As I sped down the dirt road, I could hear howls echoing through the night. In the rearview mirror, I saw shapes moving in the darkness, keeping pace with the truck with inhuman speed. It wasn't until I hit the main road that they finally fell behind, but even as the sounds of pursuit faded, I knew this was far from over. Whatever was out there in those woods, it knew I was onto it now. And I had a feeling it wouldn't stop until one of us was dead. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide a lurking threat, every curve potentially concealing one of those things waiting to pounce. But somehow I made it back without incident. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, the shotgun never far from reach. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I pored over the journal Frank had given me, its pages yellowed with age and filled with a spidery handwriting that was often difficult to decipher. What I read chilled me to the bone. The journal's author, Frank's grandfather, had been methodical in his observations. He'd tracked the creatures' movements, noted patterns in their behavior, even attempted to map out their territory. But it was his theories about their origin that truly unsettled me. According to the journal, these creatures weren't native to the Ouachita forest. They'd first appeared sometime in the late 1800s, shortly after a series of strange meteor showers. Local legend spoke of stars falling from the sky and of a great fire in the deep woods. In the weeks that followed, livestock began to disappear. Then people. At first, the locals blamed it on wolves or mountain lions, but as the attacks continued and the bodies began to pile up, it became clear that this was something else entirely, something not of this world. Frank's grandfather had dedicated his life to understanding these creatures, often at great personal cost. The journal spoke of nights spent hiding in the treetops, watching the beasts move through the forest below, of close calls and narrow escapes, and most disturbingly, of the transformations. For these weren't simply animals. According to the journal, they were once human, or at least they started that way. The meteor shower had brought something to Earth, a disease, a parasite, a curse. Frank's grandfather wasn't sure, but whatever it was, it changed people, twisted them into the monstrous forms I'd encountered. The transformation wasn't instant. It started slowly, increased aggression, heightened senses, a craving for raw meat. Then came the physical changes, increased muscle mass, elongated canines, eyes that seemed to glow in the dark, and finally, the full metamorphosis into the beast-like creatures that now haunted the forest. But the most chilling part? The transformation could be passed on. A bite, a scratch, any exchange of bodily fluids could transmit the infection. Curse? I didn't even know what to call it. And once it took hold, there was no going back. As I read, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I thought back to my encounter with the creature, to the claw marks it had left across my chest. They had healed quickly, too quickly, I realized now. And hadn't I noticed my senses becoming sharper over the past few days? Hadn't I felt stronger, more alert? With trembling hands, I set the journal aside and went to the bathroom. I stood before the cracked mirror, hardly daring to breathe as I examined my reflection. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as I leaned in closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My eyes. The irises, once a dull brown, now had a faint yellow tinge to them. And when I opened my mouth, I could swear my canines looked just a bit longer, a bit sharper. I staggered back from the mirror, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew the truth. The change had already begun. According to the journal, the full transformation was tied to the lunar cycle. The first full moon after infection triggered the final, irreversible change. I frantically tried to remember the phase of the moon. It had been waxing when I arrived at the cabin, nearly full now. With a sense of mounting dread, I checked the calendar. The full moon was in 3 days. 3 days. That's all the time I had left to figure out a way to stop this, to find a cure if one existed, or, failing that, to make sure I couldn't hurt anyone when the change took me. I spent the rest of the night alternating between poring over the journal, searching for any hint of a cure, and making preparations. I reinforced the cabin door, boarding up the windows. I fashioned crude restraints from rope and chains I found in the tool shed. And I wrote letters to my family, to the authorities, explaining everything that had happened. Whether they'd believe me or not, I had to try. As dawn broke, I came to a decision. I couldn't stay here. The cabin was too close to town, too close to people I might hurt when the change came. I had to go deeper into the forest, as far from civilization as I could get. I packed quickly, food, water, the shotgun, though I doubted it would be much use against what I was becoming, and the journal. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on the camera, the photos I'd taken of the creature, of the burial site. Evidence. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it. Maybe if I couldn't stop this, the photos could at least warn others, make them believe. The hike into the deep forest was grueling. My senses, already heightened, were on overdrive. Every scent, every sound seemed magnified. I could hear small animals scurrying through the underbrush, could smell the damp earth and decaying leaves with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. By nightfall, I had reached a small clearing deep in the heart of the forest. It was here, I decided, that I would make my last stand. I set up camp, if you could call it that, really just a small tent and a fire pit. Then I settled in to wait. The next 2 days passed in a haze of fear and desperate hope. I scoured the journal again and again, looking for anything I might have missed. I tried concocting remedies from herbs mentioned in passing, hoping against hope that some folk cure might prove effective, but deep down I knew it was futile. As the full moon approached, the changes accelerated. My nails thickened and sharpened into claws. My teeth continued to elongate. Hair, thick, coarse hair, began to sprout across my body. And the hunger, God, the hunger was unbearable. I found myself salivating at the scent of a rabbit that strayed too close to my camp, had to physically restrain myself from chasing it down and devouring it raw. On the evening of the third day, I made my final preparations. I bound myself with the chains, securing them to the thickest tree I could find. I placed the camera, loaded with film, on a nearby stump, angled towards me. If nothing else, there would be a record of what happened here. As the sun set and the full moon began to rise, I felt it beginning. A burning sensation that started in my gut and spread outward, consuming every inch of my body. My bones cracked and reformed. My muscles tore and regrew. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I screamed, the sound morphing from a human cry of anguish to something deeper, more bestial. My consciousness began to slip away, replaced by a primal hunger, a need to hunt, to kill. The last thing I remember before the beast took over completely was the sound of the camera shutter clicking, capturing the final moments of my humanity. What happened after that is a blur of fragmented images and sensations. Running through the forest on all fours, my enhanced senses guiding me through the darkness, the thrill of the hunt, the taste of warm blood, and always, always the hunger. I don't know how long I was lost to the beast. Days, maybe weeks. Time had no meaning in that feral state. But eventually, slowly, my human consciousness began to reassert itself. I came back to myself gradually, like waking from a deep sleep. I was lying on the forest floor, naked, my body caked in dirt, and what I feared was blood. The chains lay in pieces nearby, snapped like they were made of paper. As I struggled to my feet, the memories of what I'd done, of what I'd become, came flooding back. The horror of it nearly overwhelmed me, but along with the horror came a realization. I had changed, yes, but I had also changed back. I was human again, at least for now. The journal had been right about the transformation, but it had been wrong about one crucial detail. The change wasn't permanent, at least not yet, which meant I had a chance to find a cure, to stop this before it was too late. Not just for me, but for everyone in these woods who lived in fear of the beasts that hunted in the night. I made my way back to the clearing where I'd set up camp. The tent was in tatters, my supplies scattered, but miraculously the camera was still there, untouched on the stump where I'd left it. With trembling hands, I retrieved it. The photos it contained would be proof of what I'd become, and perhaps a key to understanding how to stop it. As I stood there, the weight of what had happened, of what I now was, settled over me. But along with it came a sense of purpose. I couldn't undo what had been done to me. But maybe, just maybe, I could use it. Use this curse to hunt down the others like me, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It wouldn't be easy. The hunger, the call of the beast was always there now, simmering just beneath the surface. And I knew that with each full moon the struggle to maintain my humanity would become harder. But I had to try. For the sake of everyone in these woods, for the sake of my own soul, I had to try. As I gathered what was left of my supplies and prepared to head back to civilization, I made a vow. I would find a way to end this curse, to stop the beasts that hunted in the night. And if I couldn't, if the beast within me proved too strong to control, then I would make sure that I was stopped. Permanently. The Ouachita National Forest had been my refuge, my escape from the world. Now it was my battleground, and one way or another I would see this fight through to the end. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of conflicting sensations. My newly enhanced senses made navigating the dense forest easier than ever before, but they also bombarded me with information my human mind struggled to process. The scent of decay and new growth, the sound of insects burrowing beneath the bark of trees, the taste of the very air. It was overwhelming, but more than the sensory overload, it was the memories that haunted me. Flashes of what I'd done during my time as the beast, the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill. It made me sick to my stomach, yet a part of me, a part I was terrified to acknowledge, craved to experience it again. When I finally reached the cabin, I found it much as I'd left it. The boarded-up windows and reinforced door had kept any curious locals or wildlife from investigating. But as I approached, a new scent caught my attention, fresh and human, with an undercurrent of fear. Someone had been here, recently. I entered cautiously, my newfound instincts on high alert. Nothing seemed disturbed, but on the kitchen table I found a note. The handwriting was shaky, urgent. "Cade, if you're reading this, you're still alive. Thank God. We need to talk. What's happening to you, it's happening to others. Meet me at the old church on Willow Creek Road. Midnight, 3 days from now. Come alone. Frank." Frank, the old man who had given me the journal. He was still alive, still fighting against whatever dark force had taken hold in these woods. I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in this fight. But first, I had work to do. I developed the photos from the camera, my hands shaking as the images appeared. They were horrifying, a chronicle of my transformation from man to beast. But they were also proof that what was happening in these woods was real, and that it could happen to anyone. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I pored over the journal again, this time with the benefit of my enhanced senses and the memories of my time as the beast. Details that had seemed insignificant before now took on new meaning. Locations of suspected lairs, patterns of movement, potential weaknesses. I absorbed it all. I also took stock of my new abilities. My strength and speed had increased dramatically. My senses were sharper than any human's could be. And there was something else, a connection to the forest itself, as if I could feel the pulse of life all around me. But with these new powers came the constant struggle against the beast within. The hunger was always there, a gnawing emptiness that demanded to be filled. I found myself salivating at the scent of raw meat, had to constantly fight the urge to chase down any small animal that crossed my path. I knew that I was walking a dangerous line. One slip, one moment of weakness, and I could become the very thing I was trying to stop. On the night of the meeting, I made my way to the old church. It was a decrepit structure, long abandoned, its weathered boards silvery in the moonlight. As I approached, I caught Frank's scent, and something else, something familiar. I tensed, ready for a fight. But as I entered the church, I saw only Frank, looking older and more haggard than when I'd last seen him. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "What's going on, Frank? What did you mean it's happening to others?" Frank sighed heavily, sinking onto one of the few remaining pews. "It's spreading, Cade. Whatever this thing is, it's not content to stay in the deep woods anymore. We've had 3 disappearances in town in the past month, and I've seen changes in some folks, the same changes I see in you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How many?" "Hard to say for sure. Maybe a dozen, maybe more." Frank's eyes met mine, filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We need to stop it, Cade, before it's too late." I nodded, my mind racing. "But how? I've been through the journal. There's no cure mentioned, no way to reverse the change." Frank reached into his coat, pulling out a weathered map. "No, there isn't, but there might be a way to contain it. My grandfather's journal mentions an old Native American site deep in the forest. A place of power, he called it. He thought it might be connected to why these things are here." He spread the map on a dusty pulpit, pointing to a location deep in the heart of the Ouachita. "It's here, a stone circle hidden in a valley. If we can find it, maybe we can find a way to stop this." I studied the map, memorizing the location. "It's a long shot," I said. Frank nodded grimly. "It's the only shot we've got." As we discussed plans for the expedition, a new scent caught my attention. Musky, animal, with an undercurrent of something wrong. My head snapped up, nostrils flaring. "Frank," I said, my voice low and urgent, "we're not alone." The old man's eyes widened in fear. "How many?" I focused, sorting through the cacophony of scents and sounds. 3, no 4, surrounding the church. Frank fumbled for a weapon, coming up with an old revolver. "Can we make it to my truck?" I shook my head. "They're between us and the road. We'll have to fight our way out." As if on cue, a howl split the night air. It was answered by others, closer now. They were closing in. I felt the change coming on, the beast within surging forward in response to the threat. But this time I didn't fight it. I couldn't afford to. To survive this, to protect Frank, I needed every advantage I could get. "Stay behind me," I growled, my voice already deepening as the transformation began. "And whatever happens, whatever you see, Remember, I'm on your side." Frank nodded, his face pale but determined. "God help us both," he whispered. As the first of the beasts crashed through the church's rotting door, I let out a roar of challenge. The hunt was on. But this time, I was the hunter. The battle that followed was a blur of violence and primal fury. I moved with a speed and strength I never knew I possessed, meeting the attacking beasts head-on. Claws raked across my flesh, teeth snapped inches from my face, but I gave as good as I got. Through the haze of combat, I was dimly aware of Frank firing his revolver, the sharp cracks of gunfire punctuating the snarls and howls that filled the air. But my focus was on the fight, on surviving moment to moment. I don't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the frenzy of battle. But eventually silence fell. I stood in the midst of the carnage, chest heaving, blood, both mine and theirs, matting my fur. 3 of the beasts lay dead or dying around me. The 4th had fled, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. Frank was huddled in a corner, his revolver empty, staring at me with a mixture of awe and terror. As the adrenaline of the fight faded, I felt the change reversing. Bones shifted, muscles reshaped themselves, and fur receded. Within moments, I stood there in human form once more, naked and covered in slowly healing wounds. Frank approached cautiously, holding out a tattered blanket he'd found in the church. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "You fought them. You controlled it." I wrapped the blanket around myself, wincing as the rough fabric brushed against my wounds. "Controlled is a strong word," I said grimly. "I just pointed it in the right direction." Frank nodded, his eyes darting to the bodies of the fallen beasts. "We can't stay here. More will come." He was right. Already I could hear distant howls. The survivors would be regrouping, and they'd be back with reinforcements. "We need to move," I said, already gathering what little we had. "That site you mentioned, the stone circle, it's our best shot now." Frank hesitated. "It's deep in their territory. The journey will be dangerous." I let out a harsh laugh. "More dangerous than staying here? We don't have a choice, Frank. Whatever answers there are, whatever hope we have of stopping this, it's there." The old man nodded, his face set with determination. "Then let's go." We slipped out of the church and into the night. Frank's truck was where he'd left it, hidden just off the road. As we drove deeper into the forest, following old logging roads and game trails, I filled Frank in on everything I'd learned from my time as the beast. "They're organized," I explained. "More than we thought. They have a hierarchy, territories, and they're intelligent. Even in beast form, they can plan, strategize." Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "That makes them even more dangerous." I nodded grimly. "But it also means they have weaknesses. They can be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and they're not invincible. Silver doesn't work like in the movies, but they can be killed." "By other monsters," Frank muttered. I flinched at the word, but I couldn't deny the truth of it. "Yeah, by other monsters." We drove through the night and well into the next day, stopping only when the truck could go no further. From there we continued on foot, following the map and my enhanced senses. The journey was grueling, the terrain was rough, and we had to constantly be on alert for signs of the beasts. More than once we had to hide or take lengthy detours to avoid patrols. But finally, as the sun was setting on our 3rd day of travel, we found it. The stone circle. It was hidden in a small valley surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to bend inward, as if trying to conceal the sight from prying eyes. The circle itself was composed of massive standing stones, each easily twice my height. They were weathered and covered in lichen, but I could make out faint carvings on their surfaces. Symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed to shimmer and shift in the fading light. As we approached the circle, I felt a strange sensation, a tingling that started in my fingertips and spread throughout my body. The beast within me stirred, restless and uneasy. "You feel it too?" Frank asked, his voice hushed. I nodded. "What is this place?" Frank shook his head. "My grandfather's journal didn't say much, just that it was old, older than the first settlers, older than the tribes that lived here before them, a place of power." We entered the circle cautiously. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. The carvings on the stones began to glow faintly. pulsing in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "Look," Frank said, pointing to the center of the circle. There, half buried in the earth, was a stone altar. Its surface was stained dark with what I feared was ancient blood. As we approached the altar, the glow from the standing stones intensified. The beast within me howled, fighting to get out. I dropped to my knees, my body convulsing as I fought to maintain control. "Cade!" Frank rushed to my side, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Stay back," I growled, my voice already deepening as the change began. I can't stop it." The transformation took me, faster and more violently than ever before. But as the beast emerged, something was different. My mind remained clear, unfogged by the usual bloodlust and rage. I stood now in full beast form and looked at Frank. He stepped back, hand going to his gun, but I held up a clawed hand. "It's okay," I said, surprised to find I could still speak, though my voice was rough and guttural. "It's still me." Frank's eyes widened in amazement. "How?" Before I could answer, a howl split the night. Then another, and another. They had found us. "Get behind the altar," I ordered Frank. "Whatever happens, stay in the circle." As Frank took cover, I turned to face the threat. They emerged from the trees, a pack of at least a dozen beasts, but they hesitated at the edge of the circle, growling and pacing but not entering. Their leader stepped forward. He was massive, larger than any of the others, with battle scars crisscrossing his muzzle. When he spoke, his voice was a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. "You don't belong here, half-breed," he snarled. "This is our territory." I stood my ground, meeting his gaze. "This place doesn't belong to you. It's older than any of us. And I'm here to put an end to this curse." The leader laughed, a chilling sound. "Curse, you fool. This is power. Power you've barely begun to tap into." He stepped into the circle, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. "Join us," he said. "Embrace what you are, or die with the humans you so foolishly protect." I felt the pull of his words, the beast within me yearning to run free with the pack. But I thought of the innocent lives lost, of the terror these creatures had spread, and I made my choice. "Never," I growled, and lunged at him. The battle that followed was like nothing I'd ever experienced. We fought with fang and claw, strength against strength. The other beasts joined in, but found they couldn't enter the circle. It was just me and their leader, locked in mortal combat. I was stronger here, faster, but he had experience and raw savagery on his side. We tore at each other, blood staining the ancient stones. I felt ribs crack, felt his claws rake across my back, but I fought on, driven by a determination I'd never known. As we struggled, I became aware of a change in the air. The carvings on the stones were glowing brighter, pulsing faster. The ground beneath us began to tremble. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I managed to pin the leader against one of the standing stones. As his back touched the glowing carvings, he let out a howl of agony. Steam rose from where his flesh met the stone, and I smelled burning hair and skin. Realization dawned. The stones weren't just a barrier. They were a weapon. With all my remaining strength, I shoved him against the stone. He thrashed and howled, his flesh sizzling, but I held him there. The glow from the carvings intensified, spreading over both of us. I felt a searing pain, felt my very being seeming to tear apart. The beast within me howled in agony, but for once we were in agreement. Whatever the cost, this had to end. There was a blinding flash of light, a sound like thunder, and then silence. I found myself lying on the ground, human once more. The leader of the pack was gone, nothing left but a pile of ashes. Around the circle, the other beasts were changing too, reverting to human form. They looked confused, disoriented, as if waking from a long dream. Frank emerged from behind the altar, looking shaken but unharmed. Is it over?" he asked. I stood slowly, every muscle aching. But the constant presence of the beast, the hunger that had haunted me since that first attack, was gone. "Yeah," I said, looking around at the dazed survivors. "I think it is." In the days that followed, we worked to piece together what had happened. The stone circle, it seemed, had been created long ago to contain the very force that had created the beasts. By sacrificing myself and the pack leader, we had somehow reset the balance, breaking the curse. The survivors were like amnesia patients, with only fragmented memories of their time as beasts. We did our best to help them, to reintegrate them into society. It wasn't easy, and I knew they, like me, would be haunted by what they'd done for the rest of their lives. As for me, I stayed in the Ouachita. Someone needed to keep watch over the stone circle, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Frank helped when he could, and over time others joined us. We became guardians of sorts, protecting both the secret of what had happened and the innocents who might stumble into danger. The hunger, the beast within, never fully left me. But it was manageable now, a whisper rather than a roar, a reminder of what I'd been and what I'd overcome. As I stand here now, watching the sun set over the forest I once feared, I realized that my escape to the wilderness had become something much more. It had become a mission, a purpose. The Ouachita had changed me, had nearly destroyed me. But in the end, it had also saved me. And as the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I smile. For the first time in a long time, the night holds no terror for me, only peace. This happened in the 1990s, 1993 to be exact. My name is Leland Fairbanks, and what I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. I was living in Osceola, Missouri back then, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. I had just turned 30 and was working as a mechanic at Joe's Auto Shop on Main Street. My life was simple: work, beer at the local bar, and fishing on weekends. I guess you could say I was content. I didn't expect things to change, but that summer everything did. It was a sweltering day in July when the first whispers started. I remember it clearly because the shop's air conditioning had broken down, and I was elbow deep in an old Buick's engine, sweat dripping down my face. Joe, my boss, came in looking troubled. "Hey, Leland," he called out, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. "You hear about Old Man Johnson?" I pulled my head out of the engine compartment, reaching for a nearby towel. "No, what about him?" Joe leaned against the workbench, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "He went missing last night. His daughter came by this morning, says he never came home from his evening walk." I frowned, reaching for my water bottle. Old Man Johnson was a fixture in Osceola, always sitting on his porch waving at passers-by. Maybe he just lost track of time, fell asleep somewhere. Joe shook his head. "Nah, they've been searching since dawn. No trace of him." I shrugged it off at the time. People went missing sometimes, even in small towns like ours. But little did I know this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more people vanished. First, it was Mrs. Hawkins from the library, then the Petersons' teenage son. By August, 5 people had disappeared without a trace. The town was on edge, whispers of serial killers and government conspiracies floating around like mosquitoes on a summer night. I tried to stay out of it, focus on my work and my routines. But in a town as small as Osceola, it was impossible to ignore the growing fear. The streets emptied earlier each evening, doors were double-locked, and the carefree atmosphere that had always defined our little corner of Missouri evaporated like morning dew under the harsh summer sun. It was on a Friday night in late August when things took a turn for the worse. I was at Pete's Tavern, my usual haunt, after a long week at the shop. The place was quieter than usual, the normal Friday night crowd thinned by fear and curfews. I was nursing my second beer when Sam, an old buddy of mine, slid onto the stool next to me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Leland," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you hear about what they found?" I sighed, taking another swig of my beer. "What now, Sam? Another disappearance?" He shook his head, leaning in closer. "Worse. They found something strange at one of the sites where Old Man Johnson was last seen." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity getting the better of me. "Strange how?" Sam glanced around before continuing. "My cousin works with the sheriff's office, says they found claw marks, big ones, and fur. Not from any animal we know around here." I chuckled, trying to mask my unease. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Sam." But he wasn't laughing. "I'm serious, Leland. There's something out there, something not natural. You should be careful if you're heading out to those woods." I waved him off, but his words stuck with me. As I drove home that night, the shadows seemed deeper, the darkness more oppressive. For the first time since I was a kid, I found myself checking under the bed before I went to sleep. Despite the growing unease in town, I couldn't shake my routines. Every other weekend, I'd pack up my old Chevy and head out to Truman Lake for some fishing and camping. It was my way of escaping the gossip and fear that had taken hold of Oyola. So, when Labor Day weekend rolled around, I decided to stick to my plans. I packed my gear, threw it in the back of my truck, and set out early Saturday morning. The drive out to the lake was peaceful, the radio playing old country tunes as the Missouri countryside rolled by. I arrived at my usual spot, a secluded cove on the eastern shore of the lake, just as the sun was reaching its zenith. The day was hot, but a gentle breeze coming off the water made it bearable. I set up camp, pitching my tent and gathering wood for a fire later. The afternoon passed quietly. I fished from the shore, catching a couple of decent-sized bass that I planned to cook for dinner. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I built a fire and started preparing my meal. That's when I first noticed something was off. It was subtle at first. The chirping of crickets and the calls of night birds gradually faded, leaving an unnatural silence in their wake. I paused, my hands hovering over the gutted fish, and listened. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the crackle of my campfire. A shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of the evening. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stories from town were getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness beyond the firelight. I finished cooking my dinner, but my appetite had disappeared. I forced myself to eat, knowing I needed the energy, but every sound, real or imagined, had me on edge. As the night wore on, my unease grew. I considered packing up and heading back to town, but the thought of driving those dark, winding roads seemed even more dangerous than staying put. So I sat by the fire, my fishing knife close at hand, and waited for dawn. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding pitifully small in the vast darkness. Silence answered me. Then movement. Something large was crashing through the underbrush, heading straight for my camp. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a pair of eyes reflected the light, eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire. The creature emerged from the shadows, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a horrifying mix of man and beast. Thick, dark fur covered its muscular frame, and its face was a grotesque blend of human and wolf features, its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I stood frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But when the creature charged, its roar shaking the very air around me, I knew it was all too real. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. My truck was parked about a mile away, but in the darkness, with terror clouding my mind, it might as well have been on the moon. I stumbled over a root, going down hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was right there, so close I could smell its foul breath. Just when I thought it was over, that this monster would be the last thing I ever saw, I burst into a clearing. My truck was there, a silent sentinel in the moonlight. With a surge of desperate energy, I sprinted the last few yards, fumbling with my keys. I threw myself into the cab, slamming the door shut just as the creature slammed into the side of the truck. The whole vehicle rocked with the impact. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. I tore out of there as fast as the old Chevy could manage, the creature's howls fading behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of town. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. What the hell had I just seen? Part of me wanted to go straight to the sheriff's office to report what had happened. But what would I say? That I'd been chased by some kind of werewolf? They'd think I was crazy. Or worse, that I was somehow involved in the disappearances. So I drove home, locked every door and window, and tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. But deep down I knew. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that the nightmare was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its inhuman face snarling at me. I sat in my living room, a bottle of whiskey and my old hunting rifle for company, jumping at every sound. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. If that thing was real, and God help me, I knew it was, then it was responsible for the disappearances. It had to be stopped. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, and I knew just who to ask. Joey and Cliff had been my friends since high school. Joey now worked as a forest ranger, and Cliff was a hunting enthusiast who owned the local sporting goods store. If anyone would believe me, it would be them. I called them both, asking them to meet me at Pete's Tavern. It was early, barely past opening time, when we gathered in a corner booth. Pete gave us a curious look as he brought over 3 cups of coffee, but he knew better than to pry. "All right, Leland," Joey said once Pete was out of earshot. "What's this all about? You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone." I took a deep breath, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "You guys are going to think I'm crazy, but I need you to hear me out." And so I told them everything. The camping trip, the unnatural silence, and the terrifying encounter with the creature. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief in their eyes slowly give way to concern. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Finally, Cliff spoke up. "Leland, buddy, are you sure you weren't just, I don't know, seeing things? Maybe someone was playing a prank?" I shook my head vehemently. "I know what I saw, Cliff. This wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else." Joey leaned back, his forester's training evident in the thoughtful look on his face. "You know, there have been stories for years about strange things in those woods. Most of us write them off as tall tales, but..." "But what?" I pressed. He sighed. "But I've seen things out there that I can't explain. Tracks that don't match any known animal. Areas where it seems like something large passed through, but no sign of what it could have been." Cliff looked between us, his skepticism warring with the seriousness of our expressions. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that this is real. What do you propose we do about it?" I leaned in, lowering my voice. "We hunt it down, end this before anyone else disappears." They exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Joey nodded. "All right, I'm in. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just go charging into the woods half-cocked." Cliff sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm in too. Someone's got to make sure you two don't get yourselves killed." We spent the next hour planning. Joey would use his position as a forest ranger to close off the area where I had encountered the creature, citing maintenance work. Cliff would provide us with gear, top-of-the-line rifles, traps, and camping equipment. We'd head out the next morning, telling our families and co-workers that we were going on a hunting trip. As we left the tavern, I felt a mix of relief and trepidation. I wasn't crazy, or at least my friends didn't think I was. But now we were about to hunt a monster, something none of us were prepared for. I just hoped we weren't making a terrible mistake. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. I called in sick to work, knowing Joe would understand. He'd been urging me to take some time off anyway, said I'd been looking stressed. If only he knew. That night, as I packed my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for war. In a way, I suppose I was. A war against something that shouldn't exist, something that had turned our quiet town into a place of fear and whispered rumors. As I zipped up my duffel bag, my eyes fell on a framed photo on my bedside table. It was of my parents, taken just a few months before the car accident that took them from me. I picked it up, running my thumb over the glass. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," I murmured to their smiling faces. "I hope you'd be proud." I tucked the photo into my bag. Whatever happened out there in the woods, I wanted a piece of home with me. We set out at dawn the next day. the bed of Cliff's pickup loaded with enough gear to outfit a small army. The drive out to the woods was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I directed Cliff to the spot where I'd encountered the creature, and we set up a base camp about a half-mile away. Joey took charge of setting up the camp, his years of forestry experience evident in the efficient way he organized everything. Cliff busied himself with the weapons, meticulously cleaning and checking each rifle. I found myself pacing, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "All right," Joey said once we were set up. "We need a plan. We can't just wander around hoping to stumble across this thing." Cliff nodded, hefting one of the rifles. "We should set up some trail cameras. If this creature is as big as Leland says, it's got to leave some sign of its passing." I shuddered at the memory. Trust me, it's big, but it's smart too. It knew to stay out of the light, to use the darkness to its advantage. Joey rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Okay, here's what we'll do. We'll set up a perimeter of cameras and traps. Then we'll take shifts. 2 of us sleep while 1 keeps watch. We rotate every 4 hours." It was a solid plan, as good as any. We spent the rest of the day setting up our defenses. Cliff had brought some heavy-duty bear traps, which we carefully placed around the camp. Joey set up the trail cameras, angling them to cover as much ground as possible. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, eating a dinner of canned beans and beef jerky. The mood was somber, each of us acutely aware of the danger lurking in the darkness beyond our little circle of light. "I'll take first watch," I volunteered. Sleep seemed impossible anyway, with my nerves wound so tight. Joey and Cliff nodded, retiring to their tents. I settled in by the fire, rifle across my lap, and prepared for a long night. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The normal sounds of the forest at night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were almost soothing. Almost. It was nearing midnight when everything went silent. One moment, the forest was alive with sound. The next, it was as quiet as a tomb. I sat up straighter, my grip tightening on the rifle. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. "Joey, Cliff!" I shouted, my voice sounding pitifully small in the vast darkness. They burst out of their tents, weapons at the ready. "What is it?" Cliff demanded, his eyes wild. Before I could answer, one of the traps went off with a loud snap. Something roared in pain and fury, a sound that sent chills down my spine. We all turned toward the noise, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. "There!" Joey shouted, pointing to our left. In the beam of his light, I saw it. The creature was just as terrifying as I remembered, its massive form thrashing as it tried to free itself from the trap clamped around its leg. But what struck me most were its eyes, glowing with an unnatural intelligence and a hatred that seemed to burn right through me. "Open fire!" Cliff yelled, raising his rifle. The sound of gunshots shattered the night. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as we emptied our magazines at the monster. But it was fast, impossibly fast. Despite its injured leg, it dodged and weaved, our bullets seeming to pass right through it. With a final wrench, it tore free of the trap, leaving behind a spray of dark blood. Then it charged. "Scatter!" I shouted, diving to the side as the creature barreled through our camp. It went for Joey first, perhaps sensing he was the biggest threat. I watched in horror as it swiped at him with claws the size of butcher knives. Joey managed to roll away, but not before those claws raked across his back, tearing through his jacket like it was tissue paper. Cliff was firing continuously now, the sound of his rifle a constant barrage. I scrambled to my feet, reloading as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. The creature turned its attention to Cliff, lunging at him with terrifying speed, but Cliff stood his ground, firing directly into the monster's face. It reared back with a howl of pain, giving me the opening I needed. I raised my rifle and took careful aim. Time seemed to slow down as I squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck true, hitting the creature right in the chest. It staggered, dark blood oozing from the wound, but it didn't go down. Instead, it fixed its gaze on me. In that moment, looking into those hate-filled eyes, I knew true fear. This wasn't just an animal or even some mutated beast. There was an intelligence there, a malevolence that went beyond mere predatory instinct. It lunged at me, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I tried to bring my rifle up, but I knew I was too slow. This was it. This was how I was going to die. Suddenly, Joey was there, throwing himself between me and the creature. He swung a burning log from the fire, catching the monster full in the face. The smell of burning fur and flesh filled the air, accompanied by a shriek of agony from the creature. It reared back, clawing at its scorched face. For a moment I thought we had won, but then it dropped to all fours and bolted into the darkness of the forest, moving so quickly it seemed to melt into the shadows. We stood there, panting and shaken, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Cliff broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. I don't know, but it's still out there, and now it's wounded and angry. Joey winced, the adrenaline wearing off enough for him to feel the pain of his injuries. We need to get back to town, regroup, get some help. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. We were in over our heads. This thing, whatever it was more than we could handle on our own. We quickly packed up what was left of our camp, our eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature's return. The drive back to town was tense, each of us jumping at every shadow on the road. As we entered Osceola, I felt a mix of relief and dread. We were safe for now, but that thing was still out there, and I had a sinking feeling that our encounter had only made things worse. We drove straight to the hospital, Joey's injuries needing immediate attention. As we waited in the emergency room, Cliff and I debated what to do next. We need to tell the sheriff, Cliff insisted. This is way bigger than us. I nodded reluctantly. You're right. But who's going to believe us? We'll sound crazy. Before Cliff could respond, a nurse approached us. Are you the ones who brought in Mr. Hawkins? She asked, referring to Joey by his last name. We nodded, and she continued, her voice low. The doctor would like to speak with you. It's about the nature of Mr. Hawkins' injuries. Exchanging worried glances, we followed her to a small consultation room. The doctor was waiting for us, his face grave. Gentlemen, he began, I've treated a lot of animal attacks in my time, but I've never seen anything like this. The claw marks, they don't match any known predator in this area. And there's something else. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There are traces of a substance in the wounds, some kind of venom, but not one I've ever encountered before. My blood ran cold. Is Joey going to be okay? The doctor nodded. We've got him stabilized, but I'd like to keep him for observation. Whatever caused these injuries, it's not natural. As we left the hospital, my mind was racing. The doctor's words confirmed what I had suspected. This creature wasn't just some mutated animal. It was something else entirely. We need to talk to Sheriff Benson, I said to Cliff. Now. The sheriff's office was quiet when we arrived, most of the town still asleep in the early hours of the morning. Sheriff Benson was there, though, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Leland, Cliff, he greeted us, surprise evident in his voice. What brings you boys here at this hour? We told him everything. The camping trip, the attack on our group, Joey's injuries. To his credit, Sheriff Benson listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each passing minute. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he nodded. I believe you. You do? Cliff stammered. Sheriff Benson sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 50-odd years. Come with me. There's something you need to see. He led us to a back room, one I'd never noticed before in my visits to the station. Inside, the walls were covered with maps, photos, and newspaper clippings. My eyes widened as I took it all in. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. This, Sheriff Benson said, is the history of Osceola that no one talks about, the part we try to forget. He pointed to an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, Strange Creature Sighted in Osceola Woods, Hoax or Horror. It goes back generations, the sheriff continued. Every few decades, something comes out of those woods. People go missing, livestock is slaughtered, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stops. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why haven't you told anyone? Why keep this secret? Sheriff Benson's eyes were hard. Because the last time we tried to do something about it, back in '54, we lost half the town's men. The creatures, and yes, there was more than one back then, they slaughtered them. Cliff's face had gone pale. Creatures, as in plural? The sheriff nodded grimly. From what we can tell, they have a cycle. They hibernate, or whatever the hell you want to call it, for decades at a time. Then they wake up hungry. I felt sick. All this time our town had been harboring this terrible secret. How many lives had been lost? How many families torn apart? "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Sheriff Benson turned to face us, his expression resolute. "We end it, once and for all. This time we're going to kill every last one of those things." As we left the sheriff's office, the weight of what we had learned settled over us like a heavy blanket. Our quiet little town, the place I had called home for my entire life, had been hiding this dark secret for generations. "What now?" Cliff asked as we stood in the empty street, the first light of dawn just beginning to peek over the horizon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Now we prepare. We can't go into this half-cocked like we did before. We need a plan, and we need more people." Cliff nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I'll start making calls. There are some guys I know, ex-military types, who come into the shop. They might be willing to help." "Good," I said. "I'm going to head over to the library, see if I can dig up any more information on these things. Meet back at my place in 3 hours." We parted ways, each with our own mission. As I walked to the library, my mind was racing. How many of these creatures were out there? What were they really? And most importantly, how the hell were we going to stop them? The library was just opening when I arrived. Mrs. Potts, the elderly librarian, gave me a curious look as I made a beeline for the local history section. "Bit early for research, isn't it, Leland?" she called out. I forced a smile. "Just working on a personal project, Mrs. Potts." I spent the next 2 hours poring over every book and newspaper clipping I could find related to Osceola's history. Most of it was mundane, crop reports, records of town meetings, that sort of thing. But every so often I'd find something. A vague reference to troubles in the woods, or an unexplained series of disappearances. It wasn't much, but it painted a chilling picture. Every 30 to 40 years, like clockwork, strange things would happen in Osceola, and then, just as suddenly, they would stop. As I was about to leave, a small leather-bound book caught my eye. It was tucked away behind some larger volumes as if someone had tried to hide it. The cover was worn, the title barely legible, "The Dark Legacy of Osceola." I opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble under my fingers. It was a journal written by someone named Thomas Fairbanks. My heart skipped a beat. Fairbanks, that was my family name. As I read, my blood ran cold. Thomas Fairbanks had been the town sheriff back in 1954 during the last major incident. His account of what happened was graphic and terrifying. The creatures, he called them the Nightwalkers, had decimated the town's hunting party. But more than that, he wrote about a connection between the creatures and the town itself. According to Thomas, the first sighting of these creatures coincided with the founding of Osceola. He believed that somehow the town's very existence was tied to these monsters, that we had unknowingly built our homes on their hunting grounds, and now we were paying the price. The final entry in the journal was a warning. To whoever reads this, the Nightwalkers cannot be stopped, only appeased. The price is blood, and it must be paid. God forgive us for what we've done. I closed the book, my hands shaking. This was bigger than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just about protecting the town anymore. We were facing something ancient, something that had been here long before us. As I left the library, clutching the journal to my chest, I knew that our task had just become much more complicated. We weren't just hunting monsters now. We were fighting against a dark legacy that had shaped our town for generations. And somehow, my family was at the center of it all. I arrived home to find Cliff already there, along with 3 men I didn't recognize. They were a rough-looking bunch, with the hard eyes and rigid postures that spoke of military experience. "Leland," Cliff said as I walked in, "these are the guys I was telling you about. Meet Frank, Dave, and Mike. They've agreed to help us." I nodded to each of them, noting the way they sized me up. "Thanks for coming. I'm guessing Cliff filled you in on the situation." Frank, a tall, lean man with a scar running down the side of his face, spoke up. "He told us there's some kind of predator in the woods. Said it was more than the local authorities could handle." I exchanged a glance with Cliff. He hadn't told them everything then, probably for the best. The full truth would be hard for anyone to swallow. That's part of it, I said carefully, but there's more you need to know. Over the next hour, I laid it all out for them. The creature I'd encountered, the attack on our group, and what I'd learned from Sheriff Benson and the journal. To their credit, they listened without interruption, their faces growing more serious with each passing minute. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Finally, Dave, a stocky man with close-cropped gray hair, spoke up. I've seen some strange things in my time, but this is something else. Mike, the youngest of the three, looked skeptical. How do we know this isn't some kind of elaborate hoax? Maybe someone's trying to drum up some excitement for the town, get some tourism going. I shook my head. I wish it was that simple, but I've seen these things up close. They're real and they're dangerous. Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. Assuming we believe you, and I'm not saying we do, not yet, what's the plan? How do we fight these night walkers? I pulled out the journal, setting it on the table. According to this, they can't be stopped, only appeased. But I don't believe that. There has to be a way to end this once and for all. Cliff nodded. I've been thinking about that. These things, they're not invincible. We hurt one of them pretty bad in our last encounter. If we can wound them, we can kill them. But how? Mike asked. From what you've told us, conventional weapons don't seem to do much against them. I thought back to our encounter in the woods. Fire, I said suddenly. When Joey hit one with that burning log, it really seemed to hurt it. Dave nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Most creatures have an instinctive fear of fire. If these things are some kind of mutant animal, that might be their weakness. We spent the next few hours planning. Frank, Dave, and Mike's military experience proved invaluable as we strategized. We decided to set up a series of traps in the woods, using fire as both a lure and a weapon. As night fell, we geared up. Cliff had brought more weapons from his shop, high-powered rifles, shotguns, and even a few homemade incendiary devices. It felt surreal, like we were preparing for war. Just as we were about to head out, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Sheriff Benson standing there, along with a group of about a dozen men from town. Thought you could use some backup, the sheriff said, his face grim but determined. I felt a surge of gratitude. We weren't alone in this fight. The town was rallying together, ready to face the darkness that had plagued us for so long. As we headed into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something much bigger than any of us realized. The words from the journal kept echoing in my mind. The price is blood, and it must be paid. I just hoped that whatever price we had to pay, it would be worth it to finally free our town from this ancient evil. The woods were eerily quiet as we made our way deeper into the forest. Even the normal sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. We split into teams, each group responsible for setting up and monitoring a different area of traps. Cliff, Frank, and I took the sector closest to where I had first encountered the creature. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Keep your eyes open, I muttered to the others. These things are smart. They might know we're coming. Frank nodded, his hand never far from his weapon. If they're as intelligent as you say, they might try to ambush us. We should... He never got to finish that sentence. A blood-curdling howl split the night, followed by the sound of gunfire from the direction of one of the other teams. It started, Cliff said, his face pale in the moonlight. We raced towards the sound of the commotion, our hearts pounding. As we burst into a clearing, the scene that greeted us was one of chaos. 2 of the night walkers were there, their massive forms illuminated by the flickering light of a burning trap. One of the creatures had Sheriff Benson pinned to the ground, its claws poised to deliver a killing blow. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. The shot rang out, striking the creature in its shoulder. It reared back with a roar of pain and rage, giving Sheriff Benson the opening he needed to roll away. The second Nightwalker turned its attention to us, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It charged, moving with a speed that belied its massive size. Frank and Cliff opened fire, their bullets seeming to do little more than enrage the beast. "The fire!" I shouted, remembering our earlier discussion. "Use the fire!" Cliff reached for one of the homemade incendiary devices we'd brought, lighting it quickly before hurling it at the charging creature. The makeshift bomb exploded at its feet, engulfing the Nightwalker in flames. The creature's howl of pain was deafening. It thrashed wildly, trying to extinguish the flames that clung to its fur. In its frenzy, it crashed into its companion, setting it ablaze as well. For a moment I thought we had won, but then through the curtain of fire I saw more glowing eyes, 3, 4, 5 pairs. We were surrounded. "Fall back," Sheriff Benson yelled, helping one of his injured deputies to his feet. "We need to regroup." We retreated, firing blindly into the darkness as we went. The sounds of pursuit were all around us, the Nightwalker's howls mixing with the panicked shouts of our group. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. The creatures weren't just chasing us, they were driving us in a specific direction, but in the chaos and darkness there was no time to voice my concerns. We burst out of the tree line into a large clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the star-filled sky. Something about the scene struck me as familiar, though I was certain I'd never been to this part of the forest before. "Hold your ground," Frank shouted, his military training taking over. "Form a circle, backs to the center." We did as he said, our weapons pointed outward as we waited for the inevitable attack. The woods around us had gone silent again, the only sound our own heavy breathing and the occasional whimper of fear. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The attack we were bracing for never came. Slowly, cautiously, we began to relax our guard. Did we lose them?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, a low, rumbling growl filled the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in our very bones. Then, from the shadows of the ancient oak, a figure emerged. It was a Nightwalker, but different from the others. Larger, somehow more ancient, its fur streaked with gray. But it was its eyes that truly set it apart. They held an intelligence that was undeniably human. As it stepped into the moonlight, I felt a jolt of recognition. The face, twisted and bestial as it was, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the photograph I'd seen in the old journal, the photograph of Thomas Fairbanks, my ancestor. "No," I whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "It can't be." The creature, Thomas, looked directly at me, and when it spoke, its voice was a guttural approximation of human speech. "Welcome home, grandson," it growled. "We've been waiting for you." The words hit me like a physical blow, sending me staggering back a step. Around me I could hear the confused and frightened murmurs of the others, but they seemed distant, muffled. What are you talking about?" I managed to choke out, my rifle hanging forgotten at my side. The creature that had once been Thomas Fairbanks took another step forward. Despite its monstrous appearance, I could see flickers of human expression crossing its face. Sorrow, regret, and something that might have been love. "The price," it growled, "must be paid, in blood, in family." Suddenly the words from the journal came flooding back to me. The warning about appeasing the Nightwalkers, the cryptic message about blood. It all made a horrible kind of sense now. "The founding of the town," I said, the realization dawning on me. "You made some kind of deal, didn't you, with them?" Thomas nodded, a surprisingly human gesture on his inhuman face. "To protect, to prosper, but the price was high." I felt sick. Generations of my family sacrificing themselves to become these things, all to keep the town safe, to ensure its prosperity. And now it seemed it was my turn. "No," I said, finding strength in my voice. "No, I won't do it. This ends now." I raised my rifle, aiming it at the creature that had once been my grandfather. But before I could pull the trigger, chaos erupted around us. The rest of the Nightwalkers burst from the trees, charging into our group. Gunfire filled the air, mixed with screams and howls. I lost sight of Thomas in the melee, forced to defend myself against another of the creatures. As I fought, I caught glimpses of the others. Cliff and Frank were back to back, holding off 3 of the Nightwalkers. Sheriff Benson was down, but still fighting, using his pistol to keep one of the beasts at bay. And through it all, I could hear Thomas's voice calling out to me. "The choice is yours, grandson. But remember, the price must be paid, one way or another." I knew then that this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the very soul of Osceola, and somehow I was at the center of it all. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the battle raged on. We had managed to kill several of the Nightwalkers, their bodies smoldering where our incendiary weapons had found their mark. But we had suffered losses too. Mike was down, his chest torn open by vicious claws. Dave was limping badly, using his rifle more as a crutch than a weapon. And still Thomas stood apart from the fray, watching me with those unnervingly human eyes. I fought my way towards him, driven by a mix of rage, fear, and a desperate need for answers. As I approached, the other Nightwalkers seemed to fall back, creating a circle around us. "Why?" I demanded, my voice raw from shouting. "Why did you do this? Why continue this cycle of horror?" Thomas's monstrous face twisted into what might have been a sad smile. "For the town, for family. The Nightwalkers were here first, boy. This was their land. We made a pact, one of us, every generation, to join them. In exchange, the town would be protected, would prosper." I shook my head, disgust and disbelief warring within me. "Protected? People have died, disappeared." "Fewer than would have," Thomas growled. "Without the pact, they would have destroyed everything. This way, Osceola lives." I looked around at the carnage surrounding us. This was the price of our town's prosperity. Blood and pain and secrets kept for generations, and now it seemed it was my turn to pay that price. But as I stood there facing the monster that had once been my grandfather, I made a decision. This ended now, with me. "No more," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "No more sacrifices, no more secrets. If I have to die to end this, then so be it. But I'm not joining you." I raised my rifle, aiming it at Thomas's heart. He made no move to stop me, just watched with those sad human eyes. "You can't kill us all, boy," he said softly. "And if you break the pact, the consequences, I'll take my chances." I cut him off. "It's time for Osceola to stand on its own, without this dark bargain holding it up." Just as I was about to pull the trigger, a howl went up from the other Nightwalkers. They began to retreat, melting back into the shadows of the forest. Thomas looked at them, then back at me. "It seems," he said, his voice a mix of sadness and what might have been pride, "that the choice has been made. Remember, Leland, the price will still be paid, one way or another." And with that he turned and loped into the forest, disappearing into the early morning mist. As silence fell over the clearing, I became aware of the others gathering around me. The survivors of our group, Cliff, Frank, Sheriff Benson, and a handful of others, all looked shell-shocked and exhausted. Is it over?" Cliff asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked out at the forest, then back at the town visible in the distance. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But whatever comes next, we face it together. No more secrets, no more sacrifices." As we made our way back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Nightwalkers were still out there, and Thomas's warning echoed in my mind. The price would still be paid one way or another. But for now, as the sun rose over Osceola, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. We had faced the darkness and survived. Whatever came next, we would face it as a town, together. The days that followed were a blur of activity. We buried our dead, mourned our losses, and tried to come to terms with the truth that had been revealed. The town was in shock, struggling to reconcile the peaceful life they had known with the dark secret that had underpinned it all. I spent hours poring over the old journal, searching for any clues about how to truly end the cycle. But Thomas's writings were frustratingly vague, filled with cryptic warnings and half-truths. A week after the battle in the woods, I found myself standing before the town council, trying to explain everything that had happened. It was a hard sell. Even with the eyewitness accounts of those who had fought alongside me, the story seemed too fantastic to be believed. "So you're saying," Mayor Johnson said, his face a mask of disbelief, "that our town has been, what, paying some kind of supernatural protection money for generations?" I nodded grimly. "I know how it sounds, but it's the truth. And now we've broken that pact. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The debate raged for hours. Some wanted to pretend nothing had happened, to go back to the way things were. Others demanded we abandon the town entirely. In the end, we reached a compromise. We would stay, but we would also prepare. Over the next few months, Osceola changed. We fortified the town borders, set up early warning systems in the woods. Everyone underwent basic self-defense training. Cliff's shop did a booming business in weapons and security systems, and through it all, we waited. For what exactly, we weren't sure, but we all felt it, a tension in the air, a sense that something was coming. It was nearly a year to the day after our confrontation in the woods when it happened. I was at home, poring over the journal for what felt like the 1,000th time, when the warning sirens began to wail. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside. The streets were filled with people, all looking towards the woods with a mix of fear and determination. And there, at the edge of the tree line, stood Thomas. He was alone this time, his massive form silhouetted against the setting sun. As I approached, I could see that he looked different. Older, somehow, if that was possible for a creature like him. "It's time, grandson," he said as I drew near. "The price must be paid." I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking. "We're not going back to the old way," I said. "We'll fight if we have to." Thomas shook his head sadly. "Not that price, another. The Nightwalkers are dying, Leland. Without the pact, without the renewal that came with each new generation, we're fading away." I lowered my weapon, confusion replacing fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Thomas growled, "that you were right. It's time for this to end. But for that to happen, for the Nightwalkers to truly pass from this world, we need a guide, someone to lead us into the dark." And suddenly I understood. The price that had to be paid wasn't a sacrifice to continue the cycle, but to end it once and for all. "Me," I said softly. "It has to be me, doesn't it?" Thomas nodded, a look of sorrow and pride crossing his monstrous features. "You broke the cycle, Leland. Now you must finish it." I looked back at the town, at the people I had grown up with, the place I had called home. Then I turned back to Thomas and nodded. "Okay," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Let's end this." As I followed Thomas into the woods, I could hear the shouts of the townspeople behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. This was my destiny, the final price to be paid for generations of secrets and sacrifices. We walked for what seemed like hours, going deeper into the forest than I had ever been before. Finally, we came to a cave, hidden behind a curtain of vines. Thomas stopped at the entrance. "Beyond here," he said, "is the realm of the Nightwalkers. Once you enter, there's no coming back." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "I understand." As I stepped into the cave, I felt a shift in the air, as if I was passing through an invisible barrier. The world seemed to shimmer and change around me. The cave walls glowed with an ethereal light, and I could hear whispers echoing from the depths. I walked on, Thomas by my side, as more Nightwalkers emerged from the shadows to join us. With each step I could feel myself changing, becoming something other. But I held on to my humanity, my memories of Osceola, of the people I was doing this for. We journeyed deeper and deeper, the whispers growing louder, the light dimming. I could feel the Nightwalkers fading around me, their forms becoming insubstantial as we neared our final destination. At last we came to a vast cavern. In the center stood an ancient tree, its branches reaching towards a ceiling lost in darkness. This, I knew without being told, was the heart of the Nightwalker's realm. As we approached the tree, I felt a pull, an irresistible urge to touch it. I placed my hand on the gnarled bark, and in that moment I understood everything. The Nightwalkers, the pact, the town, it was all connected. The tree was a conduit between worlds, and for generations my family had been the guardians of that connection. But now it was time to close the door for good. I looked at Thomas, at the other Nightwalkers gathered around us. They were barely more than shadows now, their time almost at an end. "Thank you," I said, surprised to find tears in my eyes, "for everything you sacrificed, for protecting the town. But it's time to rest now." Thomas nodded, a look of peace settling over his features. "Lead us home, grandson." I turned back to the tree and closed my eyes. I could feel the energy flowing through me, through the night walkers, through the very air around us. With every ounce of will I possessed, I focused on that energy, on guiding it, shaping it. Slowly I felt the night walkers begin to fade away. One by one they disappeared, their essences merging with the tree, with the earth, returning to where they had come from so long ago. Thomas was the last to go. As he faded, I felt his hand on my shoulder one final time. "You've done well, Leland," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "Osceola is safe now, truly safe." And then he was gone, and I was alone in the cavern. I don't know how long I stood there, my hand on the tree, feeling the last remnants of the Nightwalker's energy dissipate. But eventually I became aware of a change. The ethereal glow was fading, the whispers dying away. I opened my eyes to find myself back in a normal cave. The tree was gone, the magic with it. The barrier between worlds had been closed. Exhausted, I made my way back to the cave entrance. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I was surprised to find that barely any time had passed. The sun was just setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I walked back to town, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As I emerged from the tree line, I saw a crowd gathered at the edge of town. They had been waiting for me. Cliff was the first to approach, concern etched on his face. "Leland? What happened? Where are the others?" I looked at him, at all the familiar faces of the townspeople I had grown up with. How could I explain what had happened? How could I make them understand the sacrifice that had been made, not just by me, but by generations of my family? "It's over," I said simply, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The Nightwalkers, they're gone for good this time." A murmur ran through the crowd. I could see the mix of emotions on their faces, relief, disbelief, and a lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't really over. Sheriff Benson stepped forward. "What do you mean gone? What happened in there, Leland?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain. They needed someone to guide them, to the other side, I guess you could say. That was the real price that had to be paid, not to keep them here, but to help them leave. I spent the next few hours recounting everything that had happened in the cave, trying to make them understand the truth about the Nightwalkers, about the pact, about the sacrifices that had been made to keep Osceola safe. As night fell, we gathered in the town square. Someone had lit a bonfire and we huddled around it, the warmth of comfort against the chill of the evening and the weight of the truths that had been revealed. Mayor Johnson stood up, his face solemn in the flickering firelight. "Folks, we've learned a lot today, about our town, about its history. It's going to take time to process all of this. But one thing's clear. We owe a debt to the Fairbanks family and to Leland here that can never be repaid." There were nods of agreement from the crowd. I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Cliff, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." In the days and weeks that followed, Osceola began to heal. We mourned those we had lost, both recently and in the long years of the pact. We told our stories, sharing the burden of knowledge that had for so long been carried by my family alone. The woods, once a place of fear and mystery, slowly became just woods again. People started to venture out, to reclaim the land that had for so long been forbidden. As for me, I stayed in Osceola. How could I leave? This town, with all its flaws and its dark history, was my home, and now, more than ever, it needed people who understood its past to help guide its future. I continued to work as a mechanic, finding comfort in the simplicity of engines and machines. But I also took on a new role as a keeper of Osceola's true history. I wrote down everything I knew, everything I had experienced, so that future generations would understand the price that had been paid for their safety and prosperity. Years passed. Osceola grew and changed as all towns do. We faced new challenges, new threats, but we faced them together, as a community united by our shared history. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I find myself walking to the edge of the woods. I stand there, listening to the rustle of leaves and the call of night birds, and for just a moment I think I can hear whispers on the wind, not menacing but peaceful. The last echoes of the Nightwalkers, perhaps, or maybe just the memories of all those who came before. In those moments I am reminded of the words Thomas spoke to me in the cave. You've done well, Leland. Osceola is safe now, truly safe. And I know deep in my heart that it was all worth it. The fear, the sacrifices, the hard truths, all of it. Because in the end we broke a cycle of darkness that had lasted for generations. We faced our demons, both literal and figurative, and we came out stronger for it. Osceola will always carry the scars of its past, but now at last it can face the future without fear, without secrets. And that, I believe, is the greatest legacy my family could have left behind. As I turn back towards the town, towards the lights of homes and the sounds of life carrying on, I feel a sense of peace settle over me. The night is just a night now, nothing more, and tomorrow the sun will rise on Osceola, as it always has, and always will. Michigan summers hold on to daylight like a miser clutching gold, especially in the northern reaches where the sun seems reluctant to surrender tonight. It was in this extended twilight during the summer of 1999 that my then fiancée, now wife of 16 years, and another couple found ourselves on the Pyramid Point Trail in Sleeping Bear Dunes. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest before opening dramatically onto a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. At nearly 200 feet above the water, the overlook offered an unobstructed view of the Manitou Passage and its namesake islands in the distance. The elevation made you feel like you were hovering above the world, suspended between earth and sky. I carried my old film camera with its 200mm zoom lens, hoping to capture the legendary sunset over the Manitou Islands. The camera had been a college graduation gift, and though digital photography was beginning to emerge, there was something reassuring about the mechanical certainty of film. The evening had that particular quality unique to northern Michigan summers, a crispness to the air that spoke of pine forests and fresh water, mixed with the warmth of sun-baked sand. High winds pushed waves against the shoreline far below, creating a constant rhythm of crash and retreat that seemed to match our heartbeats. The forest behind us creaked and swayed, branches moving like dancers in the strengthening wind, while ahead of us stretched the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, its waters darkening as dusk settled over the landscape. Having spent my childhood summers in this region, I knew the lake's moods intimately, how it could shift from mirror calm to tempestuous within hours, how its waters could hide secrets beneath deceptively peaceful surfaces. Tonight, the 5-meter waves breaking against the distant shore were a common sight, their white caps visible even in the fading light, a reminder of the lake's raw power. By 10 o'clock the sun had finally surrendered, leaving behind a palette of deep purples and blues that seemed to blur the boundary between sky and water. The Manitou Passage stretched before us, a 7-mile-wide channel of dark water that had claimed countless ships over the centuries. Somewhere out there, the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse stood guard, though its automated light was barely visible in the gathering darkness. The lighthouse had always fascinated me, a solitary structure rising from the water, no longer staffed but still serving its purpose, a testament to human determination to master these treacherous waters. The four of us stood at the overlook, our conversation drifting between topics as naturally as the clouds above us. We discussed our upcoming camping plans, the peculiarities of northern Michigan weather, and the history of the passage before us. My fiancée, wrapped in a fleece jacket against the cooling air, pointed out the various spots where shipwrecks lay hidden beneath the waves. The other couple, experienced sailors themselves, shared stories of their own adventures on these waters, though always in more forgiving conditions than tonight's choppy surface suggested. The first flash came during a lull in conversation, a brief burst of light out on the water that seemed to pierce the gathering darkness like a needle through cloth. The timing was odd. Most pleasure craft would have sought harbor hours ago, given the building winds and roughening water. Commercial vessels typically stayed in the deeper shipping lanes further out, their running lights visible for miles. This light was different, focused, intentional, and somewhere between the mainland and the islands where no regular traffic should be. I had brought the old film camera more out of habit than any real expectation of night photography. The 200mm zoom lens had served me well over the years, capturing everything from wildlife to distant sailboats. But tonight it would become something far more important than a mere photographic tool. Raising it to my eye, I struggled to steady the lens against the gusting wind, trying to locate the source of that mysterious flash. Through the viewfinder, the world narrowed to a small circle of twilight, within which I could just make out what appeared to be a small vessel. Though at this distance and in the failing light, details were frustratingly difficult to discern. We all carried hiking flashlights, nothing particularly powerful, just standard LED models meant for illuminating forest trails and finding your way back to camp after sunset. They seemed woefully inadequate for communicating across miles of open water, but in that moment, they were all we had. Without really expecting results, we aimed them toward the source of the mysterious light and flashed them several times, more in hope than expectation. The wind continued to gust around us, and the waves below crashed against the base of the cliff with increasing force, creating a constant background roar that seemed to emphasize our isolation on this wild shoreline. The response to our feeble light signals came with shocking immediacy. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. The universal distress signal burned through the darkness like an accusation. Our casual evening of stargazing transformed instantly into something far more grave. The pattern repeated, followed by a series of structured flashes that could only be Morse code, a language none of us could read, but whose desperate urgency we all understood. The realization hit us with physical force. We were watching someone in serious trouble, separated from them by miles of violent water and gathering darkness. The decision to split up came naturally. My fiancé and I would sprint back to the car for supplies, while our friends maintained visual contact with the vessel. The half-mile trail through the woods, which had been a pleasant hike up, now became a treacherous obstacle course. Our flashlight beams bounced wildly as we ran, transforming familiar trees into looming shadows. The steep descent, already challenging in daylight, became a controlled fall in the darkness. Roots and rocks conspired to trip us, branches whipped at our faces, and the entire forest seemed to resist our urgent passage. We reached the car breathless and fumbling with keys. The late 90s cell phone lay in the glove compartment, a brick of a device that now represented someone's best hope for survival. In the trunk, a pair of binoculars nestled in their case, forgotten until this crucial moment. The dash clock read 10:17 p.m., a detail that would stick in my memory, marking the moment we moved from observers to participants in what was unfolding on the water. The call to the Coast Guard was an exercise in fighting against poor reception and the limitations of pre-GPS technology. We struggled to convey our exact location and what we were witnessing. The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm, but her rapid-fire questions revealed the seriousness of the situation. How many flashes? What was the interval? Could we estimate the vessel's position relative to the lighthouse? Had we seen any other boats in the area? Each question underscored how little we actually knew about what was happening out there in the darkness. The run back up the trail seemed twice as long, every second stretched by the knowledge that someone's life might depend on our return. The binoculars bounced against my chest, and the phone kept losing signal as we climbed higher. By the time we crested the final rise, sweat plastered our clothes to our backs despite the cool night air. Our friends' faces told us something had changed. In the 20 minutes we'd been gone, the situation had deteriorated. Through the binoculars, we could now make out details that turned our concern to horror. An aluminum rowboat, pathetically small against the massive waves, with a single occupant fighting against conditions that would challenge even a properly equipped vessel. The boat would appear on the crest of a wave, then vanish into the trough, each disappearance lasting longer than the last. The mystery of why someone would be out there in such a small craft only added to the mounting tension. The SOS signals came more frequently now, each flash sequence punctuated by periods of darkness during which we could only imagine the struggle taking place. We established a rhythm. They would signal, we would respond with our flashlights, a brief confirmation that someone still watched, still cared, still sought help. But our lights felt impossibly inadequate, like trying to empty the lake with a teaspoon. Through the binoculars, each glimpse of the struggling boat became more harrowing than the last. The occupant alternated between rowing with desperate energy and turning to signal us, each movement speaking of exhaustion and growing desperation. The waves had developed a malevolent rhythm, lifting the small craft skyward before plunging it into valleys of black water. Every time the boat disappeared into a trough, we held our breath, counting seconds until it reappeared. Sometimes the wait stretched so long that we began to fear the worst, only to see the tiny vessel emerge again, somehow still afloat. The wind had intensified, carrying the deep-throated roar of waves crashing against the cliffs below us. Clouds scudded across the moon, alternatively brightening and darkening the scene before us. Each time the moonlight broke through, we could see the rowboat had drifted further north, caught in the passage's notorious current. The sailor was fighting not just the waves, but also the inexorable pull of the water. Each stroke of the oars a battle against forces that had claimed countless larger vessels throughout the centuries. Our attempt to maintain phone contact with the Coast Guard became an exercise in frustration. The overlook's elevation that gave us such a clear view of the unfolding drama also played havoc with cell reception. We discovered a single spot precariously close to the cliff's edge where the phone would show one bar of signal. Taking turns, we would stand there shouting updates into the phone while bracing against the wind. The Coast Guard's responses were professional but increasingly terse. A vessel was en route, they assured us, but the conditions were challenging and the search area was vast. The passage of time became distorted, marked only by the rhythmic flashing of SOS signals and our responses. Each flash sequence revealed subtle changes in the boat's situation. It was riding lower in the water now, the waves breaking over its bow more frequently. Through the binoculars, we could see the occupant constantly bailing, each pause in rowing threatening to swamp the small craft. The distance between signals grew longer. Whether from exhaustion or the need to focus on survival, we couldn't tell. Around us, the darkness of a northern Michigan night had fully descended, but it wasn't the complete darkness of inland areas. The water seemed to hold and reflect what little light remained, creating a ghostly illumination that transformed the passage into something ancient and unknowable. The waves were black mountains now, their white caps appearing and disappearing like phantom lights, creating a disorienting effect that made it increasingly difficult to maintain visual contact with the boat. Near 11 o'clock we heard it, the deep thrum of powerful engines cutting through the night. A tugboat appeared from the southern end of the passage, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white arc through the darkness. The vessel moved in a methodical pattern, sweeping back and forth across the water in a grid formation that spoke of professional search and rescue techniques. We tried signaling it with our flashlights, attempting to direct it toward where we'd last seen the rowboat, but our lights seemed pitifully weak against the vastness of the lake. The tugboat's appearance was soon followed by the arrival of a Coast Guard vessel from the northern end of the passage, its distinctive red stripe barely visible in the darkness. The two ships created a choreography of light and shadow across the water, their searchlights cutting through the night like giant scythes. The methodical nature of their search pattern was both reassuring and maddening. Reassuring because it spoke of professional rescue protocols, maddening because we knew the rowboat had drifted significantly north of their initial search area. The night had grown preternaturally cold for a Michigan summer, the wind carrying a bite that seemed to cut through our jackets. We huddled together at the overlook, passing the binoculars between us, each taking turns scanning the increasingly turbulent waters. The moon played cruel tricks, every whitecap potentially the lost boat, every shadow possibly a human figure. Our flashlights had grown noticeably dimmer, the batteries weakening from constant use, yet we continued to signal periodically, maintaining our vigil even though we'd lost sight of our target. The passage, nearly 7 miles wide and equally long, had become a vast black theater of possibilities. The rescue vessel's searchlights revealed tantalizingly brief glimpses of the water's surface. A floating log here, a cluster of debris there, but no sign of the aluminum boat or its occupant. The waves had grown larger, their crests now regularly broken by the wind into sheets of spray that further reduced visibility. The sound of the water below us had changed too, developing a deeper, more threatening note that seemed to resonate in our bones. Around midnight, we witnessed a scene that would haunt our dreams for years to come. The Coast Guard vessel's searchlight swept across a particular section of water, illuminating what appeared to be an upturned boat. The light lingered for several heartbeats, but before the ship could maneuver closer, the object, if that's what it was, disappeared into the trough of a wave. When the beam returned to that location, nothing remained. We found ourselves holding our breath, willing the light to reveal something, anything. But the water remained obstinately empty. The tugboat had moved further north, following the current's natural flow, its searchlight methodically dissecting the darkness. The coordination between the two vessels was impressive, their paths interlocking to cover maximum area while maintaining safe distances in the challenging conditions. But as the hours wore on, their search patterns began to expand, moving further apart, suggesting they were transitioning from an active rescue operation to a wider search effort. Our own helplessness became increasingly difficult to bear. We had maintained our position at the overlook for nearly 3 hours, our earlier panic giving way to a deep, gnawing dread. The mystery of why someone would be out in a rowboat on such a night so far from shore plagued our thoughts. Was it a foolhardy attempt to reach the lighthouse? A fishing trip gone terribly wrong? Or something more sinister? The lack of answers only intensified our sense of responsibility as the only witnesses to this unfolding drama. By 1 a.m, the search patterns of both vessels had changed significantly. Their movements became wider, less urgent, the methodical grid system dissolving into broader sweeps across the passage. The tugboat had moved so far north it was becoming difficult to distinguish its searchlight from the occasional glimmer of distant lightning on the horizon. The Coast Guard vessel maintained a closer position, but its search pattern suggested they no longer expected to find someone alive in the water. The temperature had dropped further, and the wind carried the first hints of an approaching weather system. The moon had disappeared behind a bank of clouds, leaving only the artificial illumination of the rescue vessels to pierce the darkness. Each sweep of their searchlights revealed the increasing turbulence of the water, waves now regularly topping 6 meters, their faces streaked with wind-thrown foam. The conditions that had seemed challenging earlier now appeared absolutely lethal. Our vigil had taken on a different character. The initial adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. We took turns walking back to the car to warm up, though none of us could bear to be away from the overlook for long. The fear of missing something, a light, a signal, any sign of life, kept drawing us back to our post despite the increasingly hostile conditions. The North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, which had played such a crucial role in the evening's events, continued its automated blinking, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its waters. Its regular pattern seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of how close yet impossibly far safety had been for the person in the rowboat. The lighthouse's solitary beam swept across waters that might now hold another secret, another story to join the countless others lost in the passage's depths. Just before 2 a.m, we watched the Coast Guard vessel make one final pass near the shoreline before turning south. The tugboat had already disappeared into the darkness to the north. The systematic search that had given us hope hours earlier had concluded without fanfare, without answers, without closure. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void left by their searchlights seemed absolute, as if the lake itself was drawing a curtain over the night's events. We made our way to the small tavern in Glen Arbor, hoping to find someone who might have heard something about the incident. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing late-night drinks. The television above the bar showed nothing but late-night programming. No breaking news, no emergency bulletins, no indication that anything unusual had occurred on the lake. It was as if the entire event had been a shared hallucination, except for the bone-deep exhaustion we all felt, and the lingering image of that solitary light, flashing SOS into the darkness. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the lake's surface deceptively calm, showing no evidence of the previous night's drama. We called the Coast Guard station as soon as they opened, our voices hoarse from the night's shouting. The dispatcher who answered seemed to have no knowledge of the incident. Due to shift changes, she explained, she couldn't provide any information about the search operation or its outcome. Our detailed description of events was met with professional courtesy, but no answers. The local newspapers carried no reports of missing persons or recovered boats. The maritime bulletin board at the harbor master's office showed no notices about the incident. It was as if the events we'd witnessed had been swallowed by the lake, along with whatever secrets it might have claimed that night. The only proof we had were the dying batteries in our flashlights, and the haunting images burned into our memories. Over the following days, we found ourselves returning to the overlook at different times, drawn back by some inexplicable need for closure. The passage looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more navigable. Pleasure boats cruised between the islands and mainland, their passengers unaware they were crossing what might be someone's final resting place. The North Manitou Shoal lighthouse stood stark against the blue sky, its automated signal now barely visible in the sunlight, offering no clues about what it had witnessed. The experience changed us in subtle but permanent ways. When the passage appears in the news now, reports of rough weather, missing boats, or successful rescues, we find ourselves transported back to that night. Every detail remains vivid. The desperate flash of SOS signals, the sound of waves against the cliffs, the gradually expanding search patterns of the rescue vessels, and the ultimate silence that followed. 16 years have passed since that night, but certain questions still haunt me. Who was the person in the rowboat? What desperate circumstance led them to be out there in such conditions? Did they somehow make it to safety, or did the lake add another story to its vast collection of mysteries? During summer visits to the area, I sometimes find myself scanning the water's surface, half expecting to see a light flashing in the darkness. The Manitou Passage continues its ancient rhythms, unperturbed by the dramas that play out on its surface. Lake Michigan holds its secrets close, and for every story that ends with a successful rescue, there are others that conclude only in questions. The incident has become part of the local lore, one more tale of the lake's power and mystery, whispered about in harborside bars and around campfires. When I look at the lake now, especially during those long summer twilights, I think about how thin the line is between safety and disaster, between being a witness and being a helpless observer. The weight of those hours spent on the overlook has never fully lifted. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself drawn to the window, watching for lights in the distance, remembering how it felt to be someone's only connection to hope, and wondering if somewhere out there, someone else is standing watch, holding a light against the darkness. Time moves differently when you're young. The 2-day drive from Washington State to Minnesota stretched like an eternity in the back seat of our 1972 Pontiac Catalina, its vinyl seats sticking to my legs in the summer heat. The landscape outside morphed from the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest to the endless prairies of the Midwest, each mile marker a countdown to what I considered my second home, my cousin's century-old farm. Before my father's back injury when I was 9, these summer pilgrimages were as reliable as the seasons themselves. We'd pack the car with snacks and pillows, my mother's carefully organized road maps spread across the dashboard like battle plans. The Catalina's radio would fade in and out as we crossed state lines, picking up local stations that offered windows into lives and places we'd never see. My father would sing along to whatever came through the static, his voice competing with the wind rushing through the partially opened windows. The farm itself existed in my mind as a collection of perfect moments: the creak of the hayloft ladder in the old red barn, the musty smell of ancient railroad boxcars repurposed as storage, the taste of fresh strawberries picked from the garden. Every summer added new layers to these memories, like rings in a tree trunk, marking my growth against the unchanging backdrop of rural Minnesota. But returning at 12, after a 3-year absence, felt like stepping into a familiar photograph only to find all the colors had shifted. The farm was exactly as I remembered it. The weathered red barn still stood sentinel over fields of corn and soybeans. The ancient boxcars still rusted in their appointed places. But my perception had changed. The spaces that once seemed vast now felt smaller. The adventures that had thrilled me now seemed childish. The black and white TV in the living room, once ignored in favor of outdoor exploration, now drew me like a magnet. Billy Joel records replaced the sound of wind in the cornfields as my preferred soundtrack. Conversations about sports and music pushed aside the old games of kick the can and tag. I was caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence, too old for the simple pleasures that had once defined these visits, too young to fully understand what I was leaving behind. It was during one of those listless summer mornings, when boredom had driven me to count the cracks in the kitchen ceiling, that my cousin mentioned the forgotten graveyard. The words cut through my adolescent indifference like a knife. Here, finally, was something that spoke to my newly developing sense of the mysterious, something that didn't feel like a recycled childhood adventure. The plan came together over breakfast. We would pack sandwiches, take water bottles, and set out early the next morning. The adults, accustomed to our wanderings and satisfied that we were at least getting outside, asked few questions. Minnesota summers granted long days of light, but we still wanted to make the most of our expedition. Dawn found us in the farm's kitchen, assembling our provisions with the serious attention of Arctic explorers. The morning air carried that particular Midwestern summer quality, already humid at first light, promising a day of thick heat. We moved through dewdrops as big as marbles, our shoes quickly soaked from the tall grass. The landscape we crossed felt both familiar and foreign. Cornfields stretched toward the horizon, their rows creating valleys and canyons that only children could fully appreciate. We passed abandoned quarries, their limestone walls bleached white by countless summers, holding pools of water so clear you could see straight to the bottom. The woods appeared in patches, islands of shadow in the ocean of farmland. We stopped for lunch beside one of Minnesota's countless unnamed lakes. These bodies of water scattered across the state like mirrors dropped from the sky, each held their own mysteries. This one was small, perhaps a quarter-mile across, its surface broken occasionally by fish-seeking insects. We ate our sandwiches in comfortable silence, watching dragonflies patrol the shoreline. The graveyard, when we finally found it, didn't announce itself with dramatic fences or stone gates. Instead, nature had reclaimed it almost completely. A massive rosebush, gone wild over decades, had grown into a natural cathedral over the graves. Its thorny branches created a dome that blocked most of the sunlight, casting everything beneath in a green-tinted twilight. Entering required careful navigation through gaps in the thorny canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably inside, as if we'd stepped into a different season altogether. The first tombstone I saw stopped me in my tracks. The date carved into the weathered stone placed its occupant's death in 1863, during the height of the Civil War. The inscription was still legible, though lichen had started to claim the edges of the letters. More stones emerged from the shadows as my eyes adjusted. They all bore the same surname, Anderson, with dates spanning nearly 50 years. These weren't just random burials. This was a family's history written in stone, a chronicle of lives lived and lost on this very land. Farmers who had broken the prairie soil, planted the first crops, raised children, and eventually returned to the earth they had worked so hard to tame. Then my cousin pointed to an area deeper within the Rose Cathedral, his voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid to disturb the silence. What I saw there changed something fundamental in my understanding of life and death. 7 small tombstones stood in a perfect row, each topped with a carefully carved lamb. The stones were smaller than the others, sized to match their occupants, and the sight of them hit me with physical force. The dates told a story more terrible than any horror movie I'd sneaked watching on late-night TV. 7 children, all taken within weeks of each other in the winter of 1878. The oldest was 11, the youngest barely 2. The inscription spoke of beloved sons and cherished daughters, of angels called home too soon, of hearts broken beyond repair. Smallpox or scarlet fever. The killer wasn't named, but its devastation was carved in stone. Standing there, the humid Minnesota summer seemed very far away. I could almost see the scene, the frozen ground having to be broken repeatedly as the disease claimed child after child, the parents' grief turning as hard and cold as the winter itself. These weren't just historical facts. These were real children who had played in the same fields we'd just crossed, who had perhaps watched the same dragonflies dance over the same unnamed lake. A sudden breeze stirred the roses above us, sending dappled shadows dancing across the small stones. The lambs seemed to move in the shifting light, their stone faces wearing expressions that shifted between peace and sorrow. The silence in the grove grew heavier, more expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath. My previous excitement about discovering something cool had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of trespass. We weren't explorers here, we were intruders, disturbing a place of deep and private grief. The carefully maintained grave markers, the loving inscriptions, the symbolic lambs, all spoke of a family's attempt to maintain connection with their lost children, to create a sacred space where their memory could live on. The journey back to the farm took on a different character. The same landscape we'd crossed so eagerly that morning now seemed overlaid with shadows of the past. Every old farmhouse we passed could have held similar stories of loss and grief. The unnamed lake where we'd eaten lunch might have witnessed countless scenes of both joy and sorrow across the decades. The approaching thunderstorm matched our somber mood, its dark clouds building in the west like mountains. The cornfields whispered with increasing urgency as the wind picked up, and we quickened our pace. By the time the farm appeared on the horizon, its familiar silhouette was backed by storm clouds the color of bruises. Dinner that evening passed in unusual silence. The approaching storm had turned the kitchen windows into dark mirrors, occasionally lit by distant lightning. The adults attempted normal conversation, but something in our demeanor must have communicated that we'd experienced something profound. When asked about our day, I found myself offering only the most basic responses, unable to put into words the weight of what we'd discovered. The farmhouse itself seemed different that night. The familiar creaks and settling sounds of the century-old structure took on new meaning. Every shadow in the corners, every darkened doorway, seemed to hold possibilities I'd never considered before. The stairs to my cousin's bedroom, which I'd climbed hundreds of times, suddenly felt steeper, longer, more significant. We retreated to the bedroom earlier than usual, neither of us interested in the usual evening activities. The storm was building in earnest now, the wind making the old windows rattle in their frames. Lightning flickered more frequently, each flash illuminating the farmyard below in stark photographic moments. The thunder grew closer, its deep rumble seeming to emanate from the earth itself rather than the sky. Then, between the thunder's growls, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any storm, a low, mournful moaning that seemed to weave through the wind like a thread of darker sound. At first I tried to rationalize it as the wind finding some odd angle of the house or barn, but the sound had too much purpose, too much emotion, to be merely mechanical. I moved to the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The farmyard below was transformed by the storm into something unknown and ancient. Wind whipped through the grass, creating patterns like waves on a dark sea. The old barn's door swung back and forth, its hinges crying out in protest. Then came a flash of lightning that burned everything into sharp relief. In that frozen moment of illumination, they were there, small figures darting across the yard, moving in ways that denied both physics and reason. Their movements had a peculiar quality, like watching old film footage played at the wrong speed. Some seemed to float just above the grass, while others moved with the jerky randomness of wind-blown leaves. But they were unmistakably children. I grabbed my cousin, needing confirmation that I wasn't hallucinating. Another lightning flash revealed the scene again. More figures now, closer to the house, their forms becoming clearer. They wore clothes from another century, their faces pale as milk in the electric light. Most disturbing was their behavior. They seemed to be playing, engaging in some terrible parody of the games we'd played in that same yard during countless summer days. We stood frozen at the window, neither of us able to move or speak. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find explanations, tricks of the light, shadows from the swaying trees, our imagination overwrought from the day's discovery. But each lightning flash destroyed these comfortable explanations, showing us things that couldn't exist but undeniably did. The storm moved closer, its lightning now near constant, providing an unsettling strobe light effect of the scene below. The children's movements became more distinct, more purposeful. They played games we recognized, tag, hide and seek, the same timeless activities that had entertained generations of children on this farm. But there was something wrong about their movements, as if they were performing these games from memory rather than joy. The moaning sound grew louder, resolving itself into something that might have been singing, a warped version of old hymns or lullabies, the kind that might have been sung over small graves in a winter long past. The wind carried the sound in waves, sometimes clear enough to almost make out words, then fading into the storm's deeper voices. Eventually, we retreated to our beds, leaving the lights on like a barrier against the impossible. But sometime in the night I awoke to darkness. Either the power had failed or someone had turned off the lights. The storm had moved directly overhead, but the thunder couldn't mask the new sounds that filled the room. Footsteps, light and quick, pattered across the wooden floor. They moved with the random energy of children at play, back and forth, around and around. The air had grown impossibly cold, each breath visible in the darkness. My cousin slept on, oblivious, leaving me alone with whatever had followed us home from that rose-covered grove. The overwhelming emotion wasn't fear, though fear was certainly present. Instead, I felt a deep, crushing sadness, an echo of the grief that had been carved into those small tombstones. It pressed against my chest like a physical weight, bringing tears to my eyes that I couldn't explain. The footsteps grew closer to my bed, accompanied by sounds that might have been whispers, or might have been the rustle of old-fashioned clothing. In that moment, facing something beyond my understanding, I did the only thing I could think of. I apologized. The words came unbidden, a child's attempt to make right an unknown wrong. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." My whispered apologies continued into the darkness, each one feeling more meaningful than the last. The footsteps slowed, then paused, as if listening. The crushing sadness in the room began to shift, transforming into something else, not quite peace, but perhaps acceptance. Gradually, the pattering steps moved away, growing fainter until they merged with the storm's receding rumbles. Morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows summer storms in Minnesota. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the night's events feel like a shared dream. But at breakfast, reality reasserted itself in an unexpected way. My aunt, serving pancakes with practiced efficiency, casually asked if we'd been running around upstairs during the night. "We heard children playing," my uncle added, buttering his toast. "Thought you two were up there raising a ruckus." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, but something in his tone suggested he knew better. The farm had been in his family for generations. How many nights had he lain awake, listening to those same footsteps? My cousin and I exchanged glances but said nothing. How could we explain what we'd witnessed? How could we describe the impossible sight of long-dead children playing in the storm-swept yard, or the sound of their phantom footsteps across ancient floorboards? Some experiences defy explanation, existing in the spaces between what we know and what we feel. That day, everything on the farm looked different. The familiar buildings and fields now seemed layered with history, each corner potentially holding echoes of past lives and losses. The old boxcars, the barn's hayloft, the worn paths between buildings, all had been witness to generations of children playing, living, and sometimes dying far too young. Looking back now, I understand that what we encountered wasn't meant to frighten us. Those small spirits, if that's what they were, weren't seeking to cause harm. Perhaps they were drawn to our youth, to our carefree exploration of places they had once known. Or maybe our disturbance of their resting place had awakened memories that refused to stay buried beneath the wild roses. The rest of that summer took on a different character. We still played and explored, but with a new awareness of those who had come before us. The farm was no longer just a place of childhood adventures. It had become a bridge between past and present, a reminder that every patch of earth holds its own stories of joy and sorrow. Years later, I tried to find that overgrown graveyard again. The landscape had changed, fields had been replanted, old paths had disappeared, new fences had been erected. The massive rose bush was gone, probably cleared for farming, taking with it the physical reminder of that family's tragedy. But sometimes on storm-dark nights, I still hear echoes of those phantom footsteps, and remember the lessons learned that summer about the thin line between past and present, between the world we see and the one we sense but cannot prove. The farm still stands, passing to new generations who add their own layers of history to its worn floorboards and weathered walls. I've never told my children about what happened that night, but someday, when they're old enough to understand, I'll take them to Minnesota. We'll walk those fields under the endless summer sky, and I'll teach them that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the very essence of those who came before, their joys and sorrows forever echoing through the quiet moments between storms.